Section 36 of the Freedmen's Book, by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Prayer. Grant, O Father, that the time of earth's deliverance may be near, when every land and tongue and clime the message of thy love shall hear, when, smitten as with fire from heaven, the captive's chains shall sink in dust, and to his fettered soul be given the glorious freedom of the just. John G. Whittier. End of A Prayer. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 37 of the Freedmen's Book, by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. William and Ellen Crafts, Part 1, by L. Maria Child. William Crafts is a black man, born in Georgia. His master had the reputation of being a humane man and a pious Christian. Yet when some of his slaves were getting old, he had no scruples about selling them away from their families, and buying a young lot. Among those sold were the father and mother of William. They were sold to different purchasers from different places, and never saw each other again. They were much attached to each other, and it was a consolation to their son to think how happy would be their reunion in another world, for he says he never knew people who more humbly placed their trust in God than his parents did. William was apprenticed to a cabinet-maker, and his brother to a blacksmith, because slaves who worked well at a trade could be let out with more profit to their masters, and would also bring a higher price if sold. Before their time was out, their master became hard-pressed for money. Accordingly, he sold the young blacksmith, and mortgaged William and his sister, a girl of 14. When the time of the mortgage was up, their master had no money to redeem them, and they were placed on the auction block, to be sold to the highest bidder. The girl was sold first, and bought by a planter who lived some distance in the country. William was strongly attached to his sister, and when he saw her put into a cart, to be carried away from him forever, it seemed as if his heart would burst. He knelt down and begged and entreated to be allowed to go and speak to her before she was taken away, but they handled him roughly, and ordered him to stay on the auction block. As he stood there awaiting his own fate, he saw the cart moving slowly away. The tears were rolling down his sister's cheeks, and she stretched her hands toward him with a movement of despair. The thought that he could do nothing for her, and that they might never meet more, almost killed him. His eyes were blinded with tears, and when he could see again, the cart was gone. He was bought by the man to whom he had been mortgaged, and ordered to return to the cabinet-maker's shop to work. After a while his new master took him to Macon, where he was let out to work at his trade. There he became acquainted with a quadroon girl named Ellen, whom he afterward married. Ellen was the daughter of her master, but her mother was a slave. Her handsome dark eyes were apt to attract attention. Her hair was straight, and her skin was so nearly white that strangers often mistook her for one of her master's own white family. This was very vexatious to her mistress, who treated her so harshly that the poor child had no comfort of her life. When she was 11 years old, she was given to a daughter of her mistress, who was about to be married to a gentleman living in Macon. It was painful to part from her poor mother, but she was glad to get away from the incessant cruelty of her old mistress. Her new mistress proved more humane. In her service Ellen grew up without being exposed to some of the most degrading influences of slavery. She and the intelligent young cabinet-maker formed an attachment for each other soon after they were acquainted. But Ellen had seen so much of the separation of families and slavery that she was very reluctant to marry. Whenever William said anything about it, she reminded him that they were both slaves, and that if they were married either of their masters could separate them whenever they chose. William remembered, with bitterness of heart, how his father and mother and brother had been sold, and how his sister had been torn from him without his being allowed to bid her good-bye. He had not been tortured in his own person, but he had seen other slaves cruelly whipped and branded with hot iron, hunted and torn by bloodhounds, and even burned alive, merely for trying to get their freedom. In view of these things, he had a great horror of bringing children into the world to be slaves. He and Ellen often talked together about escaping to the North and being married there. But they reflected that they would have to travel 1,000 miles before they could reach any free state. They knew that bloodhounds and slave hunters would be put upon their track, that if they were taken they would be subjected to terrible tortures, and that even if they succeeded in reaching the free states, they would still be in danger of being delivered up to their masters. They talked over a variety of plans, but the prospect of escape seemed so discouraging that at last they concluded to ask their owner's consent to their marriage, and they resolved to be as contented as they could in the situation to which they were born. But they were too intelligent not to know that a great wrong was done to them by keeping them in slavery. William shuddered to think into what cruel and licentious hands his dear wife might fall if she should be sold by her present owners, and Ellen was filled with great anguish whenever she thought what might happen to her children if she should be a mother. They were always thinking and talking about freedom, and they often prayed earnestly to God that some way of escape might be opened for them. In December, 1848, a bold plan came into William's mind. He thought that if his wife were dressed in men's clothes, she could easily pass for a white gentleman, and that he could accompany her on her travels as her negro slave. Ellen, who was very modest and timid, at first shrank from the idea, but after reflecting more upon their hopeless situation, she said, "It seems too difficult for us to undertake, but I feel that God is on our side, and with his help we may carry it through. We will try." It was contrary to law for white men in the Southern States to sell anything secretly to slaves, but there were always enough ready to do it for the sake of getting money, especially as they knew that no colored man was allowed to testify against a white man. William was skillful and diligent at his trade, and though his wages all went to his master, he had contrived to lay up money by doing jobs for others in extra hours. He therefore found little difficulty in buying the various articles of a gentleman's dress, at different times and in different parts of the town. He had previously made Ellen a chest of drawers, with locks and key, and as she was a favorite and trusted slave, she was allowed to keep it for her own use in the little room where she slept. As fast as the articles were brought, they were secretly conveyed to her, and she locked them up. The next important thing was to obtain leave of absence for a few days. It was near Christmas time, when kind slaveholders sometimes permit favorite slaves to be absent on a visit to friends or relatives. But Ellen's services were very necessary to her mistress, and she had to ask many times before she could obtain written permission to be gone for a few days. The cabinet-maker for whom William worked was persuaded to give him a similar paper, but he charged him to be sure and return as soon as the time was up, because he should need him very much. There was still another difficulty in the way. Travelers were required to register their names at the custom-houses and hotels, and to sign a certificate for the slaves who accompanied them. When Ellen remembered this, it made her weep bitterly to think that she could not write. But in a few moments she wiped her eyes and said with a smile, "I will poultice my right hand and put it in a sling, and then there will be a good excuse for asking the officers to write my name for me." When she was dressed in her disguise, William thought she could easily pass for a white gentleman, only she looked young enough for a mere boy. He therefore bought a pair of green spectacles to make her look older. She, on her part, was afraid that the smoothness of her chin might betray her. She therefore resolved to tie a bandage round her face, as if she were troubled with a toothache. In 4 days after they first thought of the plan, all was in readiness. They sat up all night, whispering over to each other the parts they were to act in case of various supposable difficulties. William cut off Ellen's glossy black hair, according to the fashion of gentlemen. When all was carefully arranged, they knelt together and prayed that God would protect them through their perilous undertaking. They raised the latch of the door very softly, and looked out and listened. Nobody was stirring abroad, and all was still. But Ellen trembled and threw herself on her husband's breast. There she wept for a few moments, while he tried to comfort her with whispered words of encouragement, though he also felt that they were going forth into the midst of terrible dangers. She soon recovered her calmness, and said, "Let us go." They stepped out on tiptoe, shook hands in silence, and parted to go to the railway station by different routes. William deemed it prudent to take a short cut across the fields, to avoid being recognized; but his wife, who was now to pass for his young master, went by the public road. Under the name of Mr. William Johnson, she purchased tickets for herself and a slave for Savannah, which was about 200 miles off. The porter who took charge of the luggage at the station had formerly wished to marry Ellen, but her disguise was so complete that he called her "Young Massa," and respectfully obeyed her orders concerning the baggage. She gave him a bit of money for his trouble, and he made his best bow. The moment William arrived at the station, he hid himself in the negro car assigned to servants. It was lucky that he did so, for just before the train started he saw upon the platform the cabinet-maker, who had given him a pass for quite a different purpose than an excursion to Savannah. He was looking round as if searching for some one, and William afterward heard that he suspected him of attempting to escape. Luckily, the train started before he had time to examine the negro car. Ellen had a narrow escape on her part, for a gentleman who took the seat beside her proved to be Mr. Cray, who frequently visited at her master's house, and who had known her ever since she was a child. Her first thought was that he had come to seize her and carry her back, but it soon became evident that he did not recognize her in a gentleman's dress, with green spectacles, bandaged face, and her arm in a sling. After the cars started, he remarked, "It is a very fine morning, sir." Ellen, being afraid that her voice would betray her, continued to look out of the window, and made no reply. After a little while, he repeated the remark in a louder tone. The passengers who heard him began to smile, and Mr. Cray turned away, saying, "I shall not trouble that deaf fellow any more." To her great relief, he left the cars at the next station. They arrived at Savannah early in the evening, and William having brought his master something to eat, they went on board a steamer bound for Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. Johnson, as Ellen was now called, deemed it most prudent to retire to his berth immediately. William, fearing this might seem strange to the other passengers, made a great fuss warming flannels and opodeldoc at the stove, informing them that his young master was an invalid travelling to Philadelphia in hopes of getting cured. He did not tell them the disease was slavery. He called it inflammatory rheumatism. The next morning at breakfast, Mr. Johnson was seated by the captain of the boat, and as his right hand was tied in a sling, his servant, William, cut up his food for him. The captain remarked, "You have a very attentive boy, sir, but I advise you to watch him like a hawk when you get north. Several gentlemen have lately lost valuable niggers among them cut-throat abolitionists." A hard-looking slave-trader, with red eyes and bristly beard, was sitting opposite. He laid down a piece of chicken he was eating, and with his thumbs stuck in the armholes of his waistcoat, said, "I wouldn't take a nigger north under no consideration. Now, if you'd like to sell that 'ere boy, I'll pay you for him in silver dollars, on this 'ere board. What do you say, stranger?" Mr. Johnson replied, "I do not wish to sell him, sir. I could not get on without him." "You'll have to get on without him, if you take him to the North," continued the slave trader. "I am an older cove than you are, and I reckon I have had more dealings with niggers. I tell you, stranger, that boy will never do you any good if you take him across Mason Dixon's line. I can see by the cut of his eye that he is bound to run away as soon as he can get a chance." Mr. Johnson replied, "I think not, sir. I have great confidence in his fidelity." Whereupon the slave trader began to swear about niggers in general. A military officer, who was also travelling with a servant, said to Mr. Johnson, "Excuse me, sir, for saying that I think you are likely to spoil that boy of yours by saying thank you to him. The only way to make a nigger toe the mark and to keep him in his place is to storm at him like thunder. Don't you see that when I speak to my Ned, he darts like lightning? If he didn't, I'd skin him." When the steamboat arrived at Charleston, the hearts of the fugitives beat almost loud enough to be heard. They were so afraid their flight had been discovered, and a telegraph sent from Savannah to have them arrested. But they passed unnoticed among the crowd. They took a carriage and drove to a fashionable hotel, where the invalid gentleman received every attention befitting his supposed rank. He was seated at a luxurious table in a brilliant dining-room, while William received some fragments of food on a broken plate, and was told to go into the kitchen. Mr. Johnson gave some pieces of money to the servants who waited upon him, and they said to William, "Your massa is a big bug. He is de greatest gentleman dat has been dis way dis 6 months." Notwithstanding the favorable impression he had made, Mr. Johnson found some difficulty in obtaining tickets to Philadelphia for himself and his slave. The master of the ticket office refused to write the invalid gentleman's name for him. But the military officer who had breakfasted with him stepped up and said he knew the gentleman, and all was right. The captain of the North Carolina steamer, hearing this, and not wishing to lose a passenger, said, "I will register the gentleman's name, and take the responsibility upon myself." Mr. Johnson thanked him politely, and the captain remarked, "No disrespect was intended to you, sir, but they are obliged to be very strict in Charleston. Some abolitionist might take a valuable nigger along with him, and try to pass him off as a slave." They arrived safely at Wilmington, North Carolina, and took the cars to Richmond, Virginia. On the way an elderly lady in the cars, seeing William on the platform, cried out in great excitement, "There goes my nigger Ned!" Mr. Johnson said very politely, "No, madam, that is my boy." But the lady, without paying any attention to what he said, called out, "Ned, you runaway rascal, come to me, sir." On nearer inspection she perceived that she was mistaken, and said to Mr. Johnson, "I beg your pardon, sir. I was sure it was my Ned. I never saw 2 black pigs look more alike." From Petersburg a Virginia gentleman with 2 handsome daughters were in the same car with Mr. Johnson. Supposing him to be a rich, fashionable young Southerner, they were very attentive and sympathizing. The old gentleman told him he knew how to pity him, for he had had inflammatory rheumatism himself. He advised him to lie down to rest, which he was very willing to do as a good means of avoiding conversation. The ladies took their extra shawls and made a comfortable pillow for his head, and their father gave him a piece of paper which he said contained directions for curing the rheumatism. The invalid thanked him politely, but not knowing how to read, and fearing he might hold the paper upside down, prudently put it in his pocket. When they supposed him to be asleep, one of the ladies said, "Papa, he seems to be a very nice young gentleman." And the other responded, "I've never felt so much for any gentleman in my life." At parting the Virginian gave him his card, and said, "I hope you will call upon me when you return. I should be very much pleased to see you, and so would my daughters." He gave 10 cents to William, and charged him to be attentive to his master. This he promised to do, and he very faithfully kept his word. They arrived at Baltimore with the joyful feeling that they were close upon the borders of a free state. William saw that his master was comfortably placed in one of the best cars, and was getting into the servant's car when a man tapped him on the shoulder and asked where he was going. William replied humbly, "I am going to Philadelphia, sir, with my master, who is in the next car." "Then you had better get him out, and be mighty quick about it," said the man, "for the train is going to start, and no man is allowed to take a slave past here till he has satisfied the folks in the office that he has a right to take him along." William felt as if he should drop down on the spot, but he controlled himself, and went and asked his master to go back to the office. It was a terrible fright. As Mr. Johnson stepped out, he whispered, in great agitation, "Oh, William, is it possible we shall have to go back to slavery, after all we have gone through?" It was very hard to satisfy the station master. He said if a man carried off a slave that did not belong to him, and the rightful owner could prove that he escaped on that road, they would be obliged to pay for the slave. Mr. Johnson kept up a calm appearance, though his heart was in his throat. "I bought tickets at Charleston to pass us through to Philadelphia," said he. "Therefore you have no right to detain us here." "Right or no right, we shall not let you go," replied the man. Some of the spectators sympathized with the rich young Southerner, and said it was a pity to detain him when he was so unwell. While the man hesitated, the bell rang for the cars to start, and the fugitives were in an agony. "I don't know what to do," said the man. "It all seems to be right, and as the gentleman is so unwell, it is a hard case for him to be stopped on the way. Clerk, run and tell the conductor to let this gentleman and his slave pass." They had scarcely time to scramble into the cars before the train started. It was 8 o'clock in the evening, and they expected to arrive in Philadelphia early the next morning. They did not know that on the way the passengers would have to leave the cars and cross the river Susquehanna in a ferry boat. They had slept very little for several nights before they left Georgia, and they had been traveling day and night for 4 days. William, overcome with fatigue, and feeling that their greatest dangers were now over, fell sound asleep on a heap of baggage. When they arrived at the ferry, it was cold, dark, and rainy, and for the first time during their hazardous journey, the invalid found no faithful servant at hand when the cars stopped. He was in great distress, fearing that William had been arrested or kidnapped. He anxiously inquired of the passengers whether they had seen his boy. There were a good many Northerners on board, and supposing his slave had run away, they rather enjoyed his perplexity. One gruffly replied, "I am no slave hunter." Another smiled as he said, "I guess he is in Philadelphia before now." When they had crossed the ferry, one of the guard found William still sound asleep on the baggage, which had been rolled into the boat. He shook him and bawled out, "Wake up, you boy! Your master has been half scared to death. He thought you had run away." As soon as William was enough awake to understand what had happened, he said, "I am sure my good master does not think that of me." He hastened to explain to Mr. Johnson how he happened to be out of the way. He was received with a great leap of the heart. But the passengers only thought that the master was very glad to recover his lost property. Some of them took a convenient opportunity to advise William to run away when they reached Philadelphia. He replied, "I shall never run away from such a good master as I have." They laughed and said, "You will think differently when you get to a free state." They told him how to proceed in case he wanted to be free, and he thanked them. A colored man also entered into conversation with him, and told him of a certain boarding-house in Philadelphia, the keeper of which was very friendly to slaves who wanted their freedom. On Christmas Day, just as morning was about to dawn, they came in sight of the flickering lights of Philadelphia. William procured a cab as quick as possible, hurried their baggage into it, and told the driver to take them to the boarding-house which had been recommended to them. While Ellen had been obliged to act the part of Mr. Johnson, she had kept her mind wonderfully calm and collected. But now that she was on free soil, she broke down with excess of her emotions. "Thank God, William, we are safe, we are safe!" she exclaimed; and sinking upon her husband's breast, she burst into a passion of tears. When they arrived at the boarding house, she was so faint she had no further occasion to act being an invalid. As soon as a room was provided, they entered and fastened the door. Then kneeling down side by side, folded in each other's arms, with tears flowing freely, they thanked God for having brought them safely through their dangerous journey, and having permitted them to live to see this happy Sabbath day, which was Christmas Day also. When they had rested and refreshed themselves with a wash, Ellen put on her womanly garments and went to the sitting-room. When the landlord came at their summons, he was very much surprised and perplexed. "Where is your master?" he inquired. And when William pointed to his wife, he thought it was a joke, for he could not believe she was the same person who came into the house in the dress of a gentleman. He listened to their singular story with great interest and sympathy. He told them he was afraid it would not be safe for them to remain in Philadelphia, but he would send for some abolitionists who knew the laws better than he did. Friends soon came, and gave them a hearty welcome; but they all agreed that it would not be safe for them to remain long in Philadelphia, and advised them to go to Boston. Barclay Ivans, a kind-hearted Quaker farmer, who lived some distance in the country, invited them to rest a few weeks at his house. They went accordingly; but Ellen, who had not been accustomed to receive such attentions from white people, was a little flurried when they arrived. She had received the impression that they were going to stay with colored people, and when she saw a white lady and 3 daughters come out to the wagon to meet her, she was much disturbed, and said to William, "I thought they were colored people." "It is all the same as if they were," replied he. "They are our good friends." "It is not all the same," said Ellen decidedly. "I have no faith in white people. They will be sending us back into slavery. I am going right off." She had not then become acquainted with the abolitionists. She had heard her master and other Southerners talk about them as very bad men, who would make slaves believe they were their friends, and then sell them into distant countries. The Quaker lady saw that she was afraid, and she went up to her and took her very kindly by the hand, saying, "How art thou, my dear? We are very glad to see thee and thy husband. We have heard about thy marvellous escape from slavery. Come in and warm thyself. I dare say thou art cold and hungry after thy journey." Ellen thanked her, and allowed herself to be led into the house. Still she did not feel quite safe in that strange place, away from all her people. When Mrs. Ivans attempted to remove her bonnet, she said, "No, thank you. I am not going to stop long." "Poor child," said the good Quaker mother, "I don't wonder thou art timid. But don't be afraid. Thou art among friends who would soon sell their own daughters into slavery as betray thee. We would not harm a hair of thy head for the world." The kindly face and the motherly tones melted the heart of the poor frightened fugitive, and the tears began to flow. They stayed several weeks in that hospitable house, and the sons and daughters took so much pains to teach them to read and write, that before they left they could spell a little, and write their names quite legibly. They were strongly urged to stay longer, and would have done so had they not been very desirous to be earning their own living. When they left this excellent family, it seemed like parting with near and dear relatives. End of William and Ellen Crafts, Part 1. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 38 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. William and Ellen Crafts, Part 2, by L. Maria Child. In Boston they were introduced to William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Francis Jackson, Reverend Theodore Parker, and other good men who had for years been laboring for the emancipation of the slaves. The fugitives made a favorable impression on strangers at first sight. They both looked intelligent and honest. William had a very manly air, and Ellen was modest and ladylike in her manners. Their marriage in Georgia had been, like other slave marriages, without a certificate. Therefore they were desirous to have the ceremony performed again, with all the forms of law, now that they were in a free land. They were accordingly married by the Reverend Mr. Parker, at the house of a respectable colored citizen of Boston, named Lewis Hayden. Mr. Crafts was employed at his trade, and his wife obtained work as a seamstress. They lived in Boston 2 years, during which time they established an excellent character by their honest industry and correct deportment. They earned a comfortable living, and might have laid by some money if circumstances had permitted them to remain in Massachusetts. But in 1850 the Congress of the United States, under the influence of slaveholders, passed a very wicked act called the Fugitive Slave Bill. There was in Boston at that time a celebrated lawyer named Daniel Webster. He wanted to be President of the United States, and for many years no man had been able to get elected to that office unless he pleased the slaveholders. He accordingly used his great influence to help the passage of the bill, and advised the people of Massachusetts to get over their scruples about hunting slaves. He died without being president, and I hope God forgave the great sin into which his ambition led him. By that cruel act of Congress, everybody, all over the country, was required to send back fugitive slaves to their masters. Whoever concealed them, or helped them in any way, became liable to a year's imprisonment and a fine of $1,000, besides paying the price of the slave. In all the northern cities there were many honest, industrious colored people who had escaped from slavery years before, and were now getting a comfortable living. Many of them had married at the North and reared families. But when slaveholders gained this victory over the conscience of the North, they were compelled to leave their business and their homes, and hide themselves wheresoever they could. Mr. and Mrs. Crafts had many zealous friends in Boston, but the friends of the slaveholders were more numerous. For some time past, Southerners had been rather reluctant to hunt slaves in Massachusetts, because the public opinion of the people was so much opposed to slavery that they found it a difficult and disagreeable job. But after the passage of that unrighteous bill, they and their pro-slavery accomplices at the North became more bold. One day, while Mr. Crafts was busy in his shop, he received a visit from a man by the name of Knight, who used to work in the same shop with him in Georgia. He professed to be much pleased to see William again, and invited him to walk round the streets and show him the curiosities of Boston. Mr. Crafts told him he had work to do, and was very busy. The next day he tried again, but finding Mr. Crafts still too busy to walk with him, he said, "I wish you would come to see me at the United States Hotel, and bring your wife with you. She would like to hear from her mother. If you want to send letters to Georgia, I will take them for you." This was followed by a badly spelled note to Mr. Crafts informing him that he was going to leave Boston early the next morning, and if he wanted to send a letter to Georgia, he must bring it to him at the hotel after tea. Mr. Crafts smiled that he should think him silly enough to walk into such an open trap. Mr. Knight had told him that he came to Boston alone, but when he questioned the hotel servant who brought the note, he was told that a Mr. Hughes from Georgia accompanied him. Mr. Hughes was a notorious slave-catcher, and the jailer of Macon. Mr. Crafts continued to work at his shop, but he kept the door locked and a loaded pistol beside him. Finding that his intended victim was too much on his guard to be caught by trickery, Mr. Hughes applied to the United States Court in Boston, and obtained a warrant to arrest William and Ellen Crafts as fugitive slaves. This produced tremendous excitement. The abolitionists were determined that they should not be carried back into slavery. They had people everywhere on the watch, and employed lawyers to throw all manner of difficulties in the way of the slave hunters, whose persons and manners were described in the newspapers in a way by no means agreeable to them. The colored people held large meetings, and passed various spirited resolutions, among which was the following: Resolved, Man wills us slaves, but God wills us free. We will as God wills. God's will be done. 200 of them armed themselves and vowed that they would defend William and Ellen Crafts to the death. Mr. Crafts said very calmly, but very resolutely, that they should never take him alive. Hughes, the slave catcher, swore, "I'll have 'em if I stay in Boston to all eternity. If there ain't men enough in Massachusetts to take 'em, I'll bring men from Georgia." Merchants in Boston, thinking only of their trade with the South, sympathized with those men engaged in such a base calling, and the United States officials did all they could to help them. But though they received countenance and aid from many influential men in Boston, those hirelings of slavery could not help feeling ashamed of their business. They complained that the boys in the streets hooted after them, and that wherever they made their appearance, people called out, "There go the slave hunters." They heard that the abolitionists were preparing to arrest them and try them as kidnappers, and the number of colored people who watched their movements with angry looks made them wish themselves back in Georgia. During all this commotion the conduct of Mr. Crafts excited universal admiration. He was resolute, but very calm. If there had been any law to protect him, he would have appealed to the law, rather than have harmed a hair of any man's head. But left defenseless as he was among a pack of wolves hunting him and his innocent wife, he was determined to defend his freedom at any cost. Ellen was secretly conveyed out of the city. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis Gray Loring of Boston were excellent people, always kind to the poor and true to the oppressed slaves. They spent their summers in the neighboring town of Brookline. A Boston physician, who was an abolitionist, carried Ellen to their house in the evening. Mr. and Mrs. Loring were both absent from home for a few days, but a lady who was staying in the house received her with great kindness. She stayed there 2 days, assisting the lady very industriously and skilfully with her needle. Her mind was full of anxiety about her husband, whom she had left in the city exposed to the most fearful danger. She was very wakeful through the night, listening to every noise. As soon as she became drowsy, she would wake with a sudden start from some bad dream. She dreamed that she and William were running from the Georgia slave catcher, and that Daniel Webster was close behind them, pointing a pistol at them. It was a sad thing that a man of such intellectual ability as Mr. Webster, and with so much influence in society, should make such bad use of his great power that he haunted the dreams of the poor and the oppressed. Ellen rose in the morning with a feeling of weariness and a great load upon her heart. But she kept back the tears that were ready to flow, and was so quiet and sweet-tempered that she completely gained the hearts of her protectors. Early the next evening, the same friend who carried Ellen from the city brought her husband to her. He also had been sleepless, and was worn down with fatigue and anxiety. They were advised to retire to rest immediately, to remain in their room with the door locked, and be careful not to show themselves at the window. They followed these directions, and the lady was hoping they would both have a peaceful and refreshing slumber, when Ellen came to say that her husband wanted to speak with her. She found him standing by the fireplace looking very sad, but with a dignified calmness that seemed to her truly noble in the midst of such dreadful danger. As she entered, he said, "Ellen has just told me that Mr. and Mrs. Loring are absent from home. If we should be found in his house, he would be liable to imprisonment and a heavy fine. It is wrong for us to expose him to this danger without his knowledge and consent. We must seek shelter elsewhere." The lady replied, "Mr. Loring would feel troubled to have you leave his house under such circumstances. He is the best and kindest of men, and a great friend of the colored people. That makes it all the more wrong for us to bring him into trouble on our account, without his knowledge," replied Mr. Crafts. Ellen had kept up bravely all day, but now her courage began to fail. She looked up with tears swimming in her handsome eyes, and said, "O William, it is so dark and rainy to night, and it seems so safe here. We may be seen and followed if we go out. You said you didn't sleep last night. I started up from a little nap, dreaming that Daniel Webster was chasing us with a loaded pistol. I thought of all manner of horrid things that might be happening to you, and I couldn't sleep any more. Don't you think we might stay here just this one night?" He looked at her with pity in his eyes, but said very firmly, "Ellen, it wouldn't be right." Without another word she prepared to go, though the tears were falling fast. The lady, finding his mind too fixed to be changed by her persuasions, sent a guide with them to the house of Mr. Philbrick, a worthy, kind-hearted gentleman, who lived about half a mile off. She herself told me the story, and she said she never felt so much respect and admiration for any human beings as she did for those 2 hunted slaves, when she saw them walk out into the darkness and rain because they thought it wrong to endanger, without his consent, a friend of their persecuted people. She felt anxious lest the slave-catcher or his agents might seize them on the road, and it was a great relief to her mind when the guide returned and said Mr. Philbrick received them gladly. After a few more days of peril, they were secretly put on board a vessel, which conveyed them to England. They carried letters which introduced them to good people, who contributed money to put them to school for a while. Their intelligence, industry, and good conduct confirmed the favorable impression made by their first appearance. In 1860, Mr. Crafts published a little book giving an account of their running 1,000 miles for freedom. They have now been living in England 15 years. By their united industry and good management they earned a comfortable living, and laid by a little, year after year, until they had enough to buy a small house in the village of Hammersmith, not far from the great city of London. There they keep their children at the best of schools, and pay taxes which help to support the poor in the country, which protected them in their time of danger and distress. The honesty, energy, and good sense of Mr. Crafts inspired so much respect and confidence in England, that the Quakers and other benevolent people who wish to do good to Africa, also merchants who want to open trade with that region, sent him out there with a valuable cargo of goods in November, 1862. The mission he is performing is very important to the well-being of the world, as you will see by the following explanation. Africa is 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States. It is inhabited by numerous tribes of black people, each tribe with a separate government. These tribes vary in degrees of intelligence and civilization, but they are generally of a peaceable and kindly disposition, unless greatly provoked by wrongs from others. Where they are safe from attack they live in little villages of huts, and raise yams, rice, and other grain for food. They weave coarse cloth from cotton, merely by means of sticks stuck in the ground, and in some places they color it with gay patterns. They make very pretty baskets and mats from grasses, and some of the tribes manufacture rude tools of iron and ornaments of gold. But a constant state of warfare has hindered the improvement of the Africans, for men have very little encouragement to build good houses, and make convenient furniture, and plant grain, if enemies are likely to come any night and burn and trample it all to the ground. These continual wars have been largely caused by the slave trade. Formerly the African chiefs sold men into slavery only in punishment for some crime they had committed, or to work out a debt they had failed to pay, or because they were prisoners taken in war. These customs were barbarous enough, but they were not so bad as what they were afterward taught to do by nations calling themselves Christians. In various countries of Europe and America there were white people too proud and lazy to work, but desirous to dress in the best and live on the fat of the land. They sent ships out to Africa to bring them negroes, whom they compelled to work without wages, with coarse, scanty food, and scarcely any clothing. They grew rich on the labor of these poor creatures, and spent their own time in drinking, gambling, and horse racing. Slave traders, in order to supply them with as many negroes as they wanted, would steal all the men, women, and children they could catch on the coast of Africa, and would buy others from the chiefs, paying them mostly in rum and gunpowder. This made the different tribes very desirous to go to war with each other, in order to take prisoners to sell to the slave traders; and the more rum they drank, the more full of fight they were. This mean and cruel business has been carried on by white men 400 years, and all that while African villages have been burned in the night, and harvests trampled, and men, women, and children carried off to hopeless slavery in distant lands. This continual violence and intercourse with such bad white men as the slave traders kept the Africans barbarous, and made them much more barbarous than they would have otherwise been. Such a state of things made it impossible for them to improve, as they would have done if the nations called Christians had sent them spelling books and Bibles instead of rum, teachers instead of slave traders, and tools and machinery instead of gunpowder. Of all of the African chiefs, the king of Dahomey is the most powerful. He sends armed men all about the country to carry off people and sell them to Europeans and Americans. In that bad way he has grown richer than other chiefs, and more hard-hearted. Benevolent people in England have long desired to stop the ravages of the slave trade, and to teach the Africans better things. The dearth of cotton in the United States, occasioned by the rebellion of the planters, turned the attention of the English merchants in the same direction. It was accordingly agreed to send Mr. Crafts to Dahomey to open a trade, and try to convince the king that it would be more profitable to him to employ men in raising cotton than to sell them for slaves. He was well received by the king of Dahomey, who shows a disposition to be influenced by his judicious counsels. This is a great satisfaction to Mr. Crafts, desirous as he is of elevating people of his own color. Numbers who were destined to be sold into foreign slavery are already employed in raising cotton in their native land. Wars will become less frequent, and the African tribes will gradually learn that the arts of peace are more profitable, as well as more pleasant. This will bring them into communication with a better class of white men, and I hope that, before another 100 years have passed away, there will be Christian churches all over Africa, and schoolhouses for the children. Mr. Crafts sold all the goods he carried out in the first vessel, and managed the business so well that he was sent out with another cargo. He is now one of the most enterprising and respected merchants in that part of the world, and his labors produce better results than mere money, for they are the means of making men wiser and better. How much would have been lost to himself and the world if he had remained a slave in Georgia, not allowed to profit by his own industry, and forbidden to improve his mind by learning to read! Mr. M.D. Conway, the son of a slaveholder in Virginia, but a very able and zealous friend of the colored people, recently visited England, and sent the following letter to Boston, where it was read with great interest by the numerous friends of William and Ellen Crafts. London, October 29, 1864. A walk one pleasant morning across a green common, then through a quiet street of the village called Hammersmith, brought me to the house of an American whom I respect as much as any now in Europe, namely, William Crafts, once a slave in Georgia, then a hunted fugitive in Massachusetts, but now a respected citizen of England, and the man who is doing more to redeem Africa from her cruel superstitions than all other forces put together. He lately came home from Dahomey, the shipload of goods that he had taken out to Africa from Liverpool having been entirely sold. The merchants who sent him are preparing another cargo for him, and he will probably leave the country this week. His theory is, that commerce is to destroy the abominations in the realm of Dahomey. He is very black, but he finds the color which was so much against him in America a leading advantage to him in Africa. Ellen, his wife, told us that she was too white to go with him. He was absent on business in Liverpool, and thus to my regret I missed the opportunity of seeing him. There was a pretty little girl, and 3 unusually handsome boys. They all inherit the light complexion and beauty of their mother. We found Mrs. Crafts busy packing her husband's trunk for his next voyage. She showed us a number of interesting things which he had brought from Africa. Among them were birds of bright plumage, a belt worn by the Amazons in war, a sword made by the Africans, breastpins, and other excellent specimens of work in metals. I remembered that years ago the sight of similar things inspired Clarkson with his strong faith in the improvability of the African race. William and Ellen Crafts own the house in which they live. After that brave flight of 1,000 miles for freedom, after the dangers which surrounded them in Massachusetts, it did my heart good to see them enjoying their own simple but charming home, to see them thus living under their own vine and fig tree, none daring to molest or make them afraid. M. D. Conway. Mrs. Crafts has used her needle diligently to make garments for the colored people of the United States emancipated by President Lincoln's proclamation. She has had the pleasure of hearing that her mother is among them, healthy and still young-looking for her years. As soon as arrangements can be made she will go to England to rejoin her daughter, whom she has not seen since her hazardous flight from Georgia. I think all who read this romantic but true story will agree with me in thinking that few white people have shown as much intelligence, moral worth, and refinement of feeling as the fugitive slaves, William and Ellen Crafts. In February, 1861, the Emperor of Russia proclaimed freedom to 23 millions of serfs. Finding their freedom was not secure in the hands of their former masters, he afterward completed the good work by investing the freedmen with civil and political rights, including the right to testify in court, the right to vote, and the right to hold office. End of William and Ellen Crafts, Part 2. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 39 of the Freedmen's Book, by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spring, by George Horton. Hail, thou auspicious vernal dawn! Ye birds, proclaim that winter's gone. Ye warbling minstrels, sing. Pour forth your tribute as ye rise, and thus salute the fragrant skies, the pleasing smiles of spring. Coo sweetly, O thou harmless dove, and bid thy mate no longer rove in cold hibernal vales. Let music rise from every tongue, whilst winter flies before the song which floats on gentle gales. Ye frozen streams, dissolve and flow along the valley sweet and slow. Divested fields, be gay. Ye drooping forests, bloom on high, and raise your branches to the sky, and thus your charms display. Thou world of heat, thou vital source, the torpid insects feel thy force, which all with life supplies. Gardens and orchards richly bloom, and send a gale of sweet perfume to invite them as they rise. Near where the crystal waters glide, the male of birds escorts his bride, and twitters on the spray. He mounts upon his active wing, to hail the bounty of the spring, the lavish pomp of May. End of Spring. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 40 of the Freedmen's Book, by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Good Grandmother, by Harriet Jacobs. I had a great treasure in my maternal grandmother, who was a remarkable woman in many respects. She was the daughter of a planter in South Carolina, who at his death left her and her mother free, with money to go to St. Augustine, where they had relatives. It was during the Revolutionary War, and they were captured on their passage, carried back, and sold to different purchasers. Such was the story my grandmother used to tell me. She was sold to the keeper of a large hotel, and I have often heard her tell how hard she fared during childhood. But as she grew older she evinced so much intelligence, and was so faithful, that her master and mistress could not help seeing it was for their interest to take care of such a valuable piece of property. She became an indispensable person in the household, officiating in all capacities, from cook and wet nurse to seamstress. She was much praised for her cooking, and her nice crackers became so famous in the neighborhood that many people were desirous of obtaining them. In consequence of numerous requests of this kind, she asked permission of her mistress to bake crackers at night, after all the household work was done, and she obtained leave to do it, provided she would clothe herself and the children from the profits. Upon these terms, after working hard all day for her mistress, she began her midnight bakings, assisted by her 2 oldest children. The business proved profitable, and each year she laid by a little, to create a fund for the purchase of her children. Her master died, and his property was divided among the heirs. My grandmother remained in the service of his widow as a slave. Her children were divided among her master's children, but as she had 5, Benjamin, the youngest, was sold, in order that the heirs might have an equal portion of dollars and cents. There was so little difference in our ages that he always seemed to me more like a brother than an uncle. He was a bright, handsome lad, nearly white, for he inherited the complexion my grandmother had derived from Anglo-Saxon ancestors. His sale was a terrible blow to his mother, but she was naturally hopeful, and she went to work with redoubled energy, trusting in time to be able to purchase her children. One day her mistress begged the loan of $300 from the little fund she had laid up from the proceeds of her baking. She promised to pay her soon, but as no promise or writing given to a slave is legally binding, she was obliged to trust solely to her honor. In my master's house very little attention was paid to the slaves' meals. If they could catch a bit of food while it was going, well and good. But I gave myself no trouble on that score, for on my various errands I passed my grandmother's house, and she always had something to spare for me. I was frequently threatened with punishment if I stopped there, and my grandmother, to avoid detaining me, often stood at the gate with something for my breakfast or dinner. I was indebted to her for all my comforts, spiritual or temporal. It was her labor that supplied my scanty wardrobe. I have a vivid recollection of the linsey-woolsey dress given me every winter by Mrs. Flint. How I hated it! It was one of the badges of slavery. While my grandmother was thus helping to support me from her hard earnings, the $300 she lent her mistress was never repaid. When her mistress died, my master, who was her son-in-law, was appointed executor. When grandmother applied to him for payment, he said the estate was insolvent, and the law prohibited payment. It did not, however, prohibit him from retaining the silver candelabra which had been purchased with that money. I presume they will be handed down in the family from generation to generation. My grandmother's mistress had always promised that at her death she should be free, and it was said that in her will she made good the promise. But when the estate was settled, Dr. Flint told the faithful old servant that under existing circumstances it was necessary she should be sold. On the appointed day the customary advertisement was posted up, proclaiming that there would be a public sale of negroes, horses, etc. Dr. Flint called to tell my grandmother that he was unwilling to wound her feelings by putting her up at auction, and that he would prefer to dispose of her at private sale. She saw through his hypocrisy, and understood very well that he was ashamed of the job. She was a very spirited woman, and if he was base enough to sell her, after her mistress had made her free by her will, she was determined the public should know it. She had for a long time supplied many families with crackers and preserves. Consequently, Aunt Marthy, as she was called, was generally known, and all who knew her respected her intelligence and good character. It was also well known that her mistress had intended to leave her free, as a reward for her long and faithful services. When the day of sale came, she took her place among the chattel, and at the first call she sprang upon the auction block. She was then 50 years old. Many voices shouted out, "Shame! Shame! Who's going to sell you, Aunt Marthy? Don't stand there. That's no place for you." She made no answer, but quietly awaited her fate. No one bid for her. At last a feeble voice said, $50. It came from a maiden lady, 70 years old, the sister of my grandmother's deceased mistress. She had lived 40 years under the same roof with my grandmother. She knew how faithfully she had served her owners, and how cruelly she had been defrauded of her rights, and she resolved to protect her. The auctioneer waited for a higher bid, but her wishes were respected. No one bid above her. The old lady could neither read nor write, and when the bill of sale was made out, she signed it with a cross. But of what consequence was that, when she had a big heart overflowing with human kindness? She gave the faithful old servant her freedom. My grandmother had always been a mother to her orphan grandchildren, as far as that was possible in a condition of slavery. Her perseverance and unwearied industry continued unabated after her time was her own, and she soon became mistress of a snug little home, and surrounded herself with the necessaries of life. She would have been happy if her family could have shared them with her. There remained to her but 3 children and 2 grandchildren, and they were all slaves. Most earnestly did she strive to make us feel that it was the will of God, that he had seen fit to place us under such circumstances, and though it seemed hard, we ought to pray for contentment. It was a beautiful faith, coming from a mother who could not call her children her own. But I and Benjamin, her youngest boy, condemned it. It appeared to us that it was much more according to the will of God that we should be free, and able to make a home for ourselves as she had done. There we always found balsam for our troubles. She was so loving, so sympathizing. She always met us with a smile, and listened with patience to all our sorrows. She spoke so hopefully that unconsciously the clouds gave place to sunshine. There was a grand big oven there, too, that baked bread and nice things for the town, and we knew there was always a choice bit in store for us. But even the charms of that old oven failed to reconcile us to our hard lot. Benjamin was now a tall, handsome lad, strongly and gracefully made, and with a spirit too bold and daring for a slave. One day his master attempted to flog him for not obeying his summons quickly enough. Benjamin resisted, and in the struggle threw his master down. To raise his hand against a white man was a great crime, according to the laws of the state, and to avoid a cruel public whipping, Benjamin hid himself and made his escape. My grandmother was absent, visiting an old friend in the country, when this happened. When she returned, and found her youngest child had fled, great was her sorrow. But with characteristic piety, she said, "God's will be done." Every morning she inquired whether any news had been heard from her boy. Alas! news did come. Sad news. The master received a letter, and was rejoicing over the capture of his human chattel. That day seems to me but as yesterday, so well do I remember it. I saw him led through the streets in chains to jail. His face was ghastly pale, but full of determination. He had sent some one to his mother's house to ask her not to come to meet him. He said the sight of her distress would take from him all self-control. Her heart yearned to see him, and she went. But she screened herself in the crowd, that it might be as her child had said. We were not allowed to visit him, but we had known the jailer for years, and he was a kind-hearted man. At midnight he opened the door for my grandmother and myself to enter, in disguise. When we entered the cell, not a sound broke the stillness. "Benjamin," whispered my grandmother. No answer. "Benjamin," said she, again in a faltering tone. There was a jingling of chains. The moon had just risen and cast an uncertain light through the bars. We knelt down and took Benjamin's cold hands in ours. Sobs alone were heard, while she wept upon his neck. At last Benjamin's lips were unsealed. Mother and son talked together. He asked her pardon for the suffering he had caused her. She told him she had nothing to forgive, that she could not blame him for wanting to be free. He told her that he broke away from his captors, and was about to throw himself into the river, but thoughts of her came over him and arrested the movement. She asked him if he did not also think of God. He replied, "No, mother, I did not. When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets that there is a God." The pious mother shuddered as she said, "Don't talk so, Benjamin. Try to be humble, and put your trust in God." "I wish I had some of your goodness," he replied. "You bear everything patiently, just as though you thought it was all right. I wish I could." She told him it had not always been so with her, that once she was like him, but when sore troubles came upon her, and she had no arm to lean upon, she learned to call on God, and he lightened her burdens. She besought him to do so likewise. The jailer came to tell us we had overstayed our time, and we were obliged to hurry away. Grandmother went to the master and tried to intercede for her son, but he was inexorable. He said Benjamin should be made an example of, that he should be kept in jail till he was sold. For 3 months he remained within the walls of the prison, during which time grandmother secretly conveyed him changes of clothes, and as often as possible carried him something warm for supper, accompanied with some little luxury for her friend the jailer. He was finally sold to a slave trader from New Orleans. When they fastened irons upon his wrists to drive him off with the coffle, it was heart-rending to hear the groans of that poor mother, as she clung to the Benjamin of her family, her youngest, her pet. He was pale and thin now, from hardships and long confinement, but still his good looks were so observable that the slave trader remarked he would give any price for the handsome lad, if he were a girl. We, who knew so well what Slavery was, were thankful that he was not. Grandmother stifled her grief, and with strong arms and unwavering faith set to work to purchase freedom for Benjamin. She knew the slave trader would charge 3 times as much as he gave for him, but she was not discouraged. She employed a lawyer to write to New Orleans, and try to negotiate the business for her, but word came that Benjamin was missing. He had run away again. Philip, my grandmother's only remaining son, inherited his mother's intelligence. His mistress sometimes trusted him to go with a cargo to New York. One of these occasions occurred not long after Benjamin's second escape. Through God's good providence the brothers met in the streets of New York. It was a happy meeting, though Benjamin was very pale and thin, for on his way from bondage he had been taken violently ill, and brought nigh unto death. Eagerly he embraced his brother, exclaiming, "Oh, Phil, here I am at last! I came nigh dying when I was almost in sight of freedom. And oh, how I prayed that I might live just to get one breath of free air! And here I am. In the old jail I used to wish I was dead. But life is worth something now, and it would be hard to die." He begged his brother not to go back to the South, but to stay and work with him till they earned enough to buy their relatives. Philip replied, "It would kill mother if I deserted her. She has pledged her house, and is working harder than ever to buy you. Will you be bought?" "Never," replied Benjamin in his resolute tone. "When I have got so far out of their clutches, do you suppose, Phil, that I would ever let them be paid 1 red cent? Do you think I would consent to have mother turned out of her hard-earned home in her old age, and she never to see me after she had bought me? For you know, Phil, she would never leave the South while any of her children or her grandchildren remained in slavery. What a good mother! Tell her to buy you, Phil. You have always been a comfort to her, and I have always been making her trouble." Philip furnished his brother with some clothes, and gave him what money he had. Benjamin pressed his hand, and said, with moistened eyes, "I part from all my kindred." And so it proved. We never heard from him afterwards. When Uncle Philip came home, the first words he said on entering the house were, "Oh, mother, Ben is free! I have seen him in New York." For a moment she seemed bewildered. He laid his hand gently on her shoulder, and repeated what he had said. She raised her hands devoutly, and exclaimed, "God be praised! Let us thank him." She dropped on her knees, and poured forth her heart in prayer. When she grew calmer, she begged Philip to sit down and repeat every word her son had said. He told her all, except that Benjamin had nearly died on the way, and was looking very pale and thin. Still the brave old woman toiled on to accomplish the rescue of her remaining children. After a while she succeeded in buying Philip, for whom she paid $800, and came home with the precious document that secured his freedom. The happy mother and son sat by her hearthstone that night, telling how proud they were of each other, and how they would prove to the world that they could take care of themselves, as they had long taken care of others. We all concluded by saying, "He that is willing to be a slave, let him be a slave." My grandmother had still one daughter remaining in slavery. She belonged to the same master that I did, and a hard time she had of it. She was a good soul, this old Aunt Nancy. She did all she could to supply the place of my lost mother to us orphans. She was the factotum of our master's household. She was housekeeper, waiting maid, and everything else. Nothing went on well without her, by day or by night. She wore herself out in their service. Grandmother toiled on, hoping to purchase release for her. But one evening word was brought that she had been suddenly attacked with paralysis, and grandmother hastened to her bedside. Mother and daughter had always been devotedly attached to each other, and now they looked lovingly and earnestly into each other's eyes, longing to speak of secrets that weighed on the hearts of both. She lived but 2 days, and on the last day she was speechless. It was sad to witness the grief of her bereaved mother. She had always been strong to bear, and religious faith still supported her. But her dark life had become still darker, and age and trouble were leaving deep traces on her withered face. The poor old back was fitted to its burden. It bent under it, but it did not break. Uncle Philip asked permission to bury his sister at his own expense, and slaveholders are always ready to grant such favors to slaves and their relatives. The arrangements were very plain, but perfectly respectable. It was talked of by the slaves as a mighty grand funeral. If Northern travelers had been passing through the place, perhaps they would have described it as a beautiful tribute to the humble dead, a touching proof of the attachment between slaveholders and their slaves. And very likely the mistress would have confirmed this impression, with her handkerchief at her eyes. We could have told them how the poor old mother had toiled, year after year, to buy her son Philip's right to own his own earnings, and how that same Philip had paid the expenses of the funeral which they regarded as doing so much credit to the master. There were some redeeming features in our hard destiny. Very pleasant are my recollections of the good old lady who paid $50 for the purpose of making my grandmother free, when she stood on the auction block. She loved this old lady, whom we all called Miss Fanny. She often took tea at grandmother's house. On such occasions the table was spread with a snow-white cloth, and the china cups and silver spoons were taken from the old-fashioned buffet. There were hot muffins, tea rusks, and delicious sweetmeats. My grandmother always had a supply of such articles, because she furnished the ladies of the town with such things for their parties. She kept 2 cows for that purpose, and the fresh cream was Miss Fanny's delight. She invariably repeated that it was the very best in town. The old ladies had cosy times together. They would work and chat, and sometimes, while talking over old times, their spectacles would get dim with tears, and would have to be taken off and wiped. When Miss Fanny bade us good-bye, her bag was always filled with grandmother's best cakes, and she was urged to come again soon. Here follows a long account of persecutions endured by the granddaughter who tells this story. She finally made her escape, after encountering great dangers and hardships. The faithful old grandmother concealed her for a long time at great risk to them both, during which time she tried in vain to buy free papers for her. At last there came a chance to escape in a vessel northward bound. She goes on to say: "All arrangements were made for me to go on board at dusk. Grandmother came to me with a small bag of money, which she wanted me to take. I begged her to keep at least part of it, but she insisted, while the tears fell fast, that I should take the whole. 'You may be sick among strangers,' she said, 'and they would send you to the poorhouse to die.' Ah, that good grandmother! Though I had the blessed prospect of freedom before me, I felt dreadfully sad at leaving forever that old homestead, that had received and sheltered me in so many sorrows. Grandmother took me by the hand and said, 'My child, let us pray.' We knelt down together, with my arm clasped round the faithful, loving old friend I was about to leave forever. On no other occasion had it been my lot to listen to so fervent a supplication for mercy and protection. It thrilled through my heart and inspired me with trust in God. I staggered into the street, faint in body, though strong of purpose. I did not look back upon the dear old place, though I felt that I should never see it again. The granddaughter found friends at the North, and being uncommonly quick in her perceptions, She soon did much to supply the deficiencies of early education. While leading a worthy, industrious life in New York, she twice very narrowly escaped becoming a victim to the infamous fugitive slave law. A noble-hearted lady purchased her freedom, and thereby rescued her from further danger. She thus closes the story of her venerable ancestor: "My grandmother lived to rejoice in the knowledge of my freedom; but not long afterward a letter came to me with a black seal. It was from a friend at the South, who informed me that she had gone where the wicked cease from troubling, and where the weary are at rest. Among the gloomy recollections of my life in bondage come tender memories of that good grandmother, like a few fleecy clouds floating over a dark and troubled sea. H. J. Note: the above account is no fiction. The author, who was 30 years in Slavery, wrote it in an interesting book entitled Linda. She is an esteemed friend of mine, and I introduce this portion of her story here to illustrate the power of character over circumstances. She has intense sympathy for those who are still suffering in the bondage from which she escaped. She has devoted all her energies to the poor refugees in our camps, comforting the afflicted, nursing the sick, and teaching the children. On the 1st of January, 1863, she wrote me a letter which began as follows: "I have lived to hear the proclamation of freedom for my suffering people. All my wrongs are forgiven. I am more than repaid for all I have endured. Glory to God in the highest. L. M. Child." They cannot take care of themselves. Our tobacco they plant, and our cotton they pick, and our rice they can harvest and thrash. They feed us in health, and they nurse us when sick, and they earn while we pocket our cash. They lead us when young, and they help us when old, and their toil loads our tables and shelves. But they're niggers, and therefore the truth must be told: they cannot take care of themselves. Rev. John Pierpont. End of The Good Grandmother. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 41 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Colored Mother's Prayer. Great Father, who created all, the colored and the fair, O listen to a mother's call, hear thou the negro's prayer. Yet once again thy people teach, with lessons from above, that they may practice what they preach, and all their neighbors love. Again the gospel precepts give, teach them this rule to know: such treatment as ye should receive, be willing to bestow. Then my poor child, my darling one, will never feel the smart of their unjust and cruel scorn that withers all the heart. Great Father, who created all, the colored and the fair, O listen to a mother's call, hear thou the negro's prayer. End of The Colored Mother's Prayer. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 42 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. William Costin. Mr. William Costin was for 24 years porter of a bank in Washington, D.C. Many millions of dollars passed through his hands, but not a cent was ever missing, through fraud or carelessness. In his daily life he set an example of purity and benevolence. He adopted 4 orphan children into his family, and treated them with the kindness of a father. His character inspired general respect, and when he died in 1842 the newspapers of the city made honorable mention of him. The directors of the bank passed a resolution expressive of their high appreciation of his services, and his coffin was followed to the grave by a very large procession of citizens of all classes and complexions. Not long after, when the Honorable John Quincy Adams was speaking in Congress on the subject of voting, he said, "The late William Costin, though he was not white, was as much respected as any man in the district, and the large concourse of citizens that attended his remains to the grave, as well white as black, was an evidence of the manner in which he was estimated by the citizens of Washington. Now why should such a man as that be excluded from the elective franchise, when you admit the vilest individuals of the white race to exercise it?" End of William Costin. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 43 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Education of Children by L. Maria Child. Strain every nerve, wrestle with every power God and nature have put into your hands, for your place among the races of this Western world. Wendell Phillips. People of all colors and conditions love their offspring, but very few consider sufficiently how much the future character and happiness of their children depend on their own daily language and habits. It does very little good to teach children to be honest if the person who teaches them is not scrupulous about taking other people's property, or using it without leave. It does very little good to tell them they ought to be modest, if they are accustomed to hear their elders use unclean words or tell indecent stories. Primers and catechisms may teach them to reverence God, but the lesson will lose half its effect if they habitually hear their parents curse and swear. Some 200 years ago a very learned astronomer, named Sir Isaac Newton, lived in England. He was so devout that he always took off his hat when the name of God was mentioned. By that act of reverence he taught a religious lesson to every child who witnessed it. Young souls are fed by what they see and hear, just as their bodies are fed with daily food. No parents who knew what they were doing would give their little ones poisonous food that would produce fevers, ulcers, and death. It is of far more consequence not to poison their souls, for the body passes away, but the soul is immortal. When a traveler pointed to a stunted and crooked tree and asked what made it grow so, a child replied, "I suppose somebody trod on it when it was little." It is hard for children born in slavery to grow up spiritually straight and healthy, because they are trodden on when they are little. Being constantly treated unjustly, they cannot learn to be just. Their parents have no power to protect them from evil influences. They cannot prevent their continually seeing cruel and indecent actions, and hearing profane and dirty words. Heretofore you could not educate your children either morally or intellectually. But now that you are free men, responsibility rests upon you. You will be answerable before God for the influence you exert over the young souls entrusted to your care. You may be too ignorant to teach them much of book learning, and you may be too poor to spend much money for their education, but you can set them a pure and good example by your conduct and conversation. This you should try your utmost to do, and should pray to the Heavenly Father to help you, for it is a very solemn duty, this rearing of young souls for eternity. That you yourselves have had a stunted growth from being trodden upon when you were little will doubtless make you more careful not to tread upon them. It is necessary that children should be made obedient to their elders, because they are not old enough to know what is good for themselves. but obedience should always be obtained by the gentlest means possible. Violence excites anger and hatred, without doing any good to counterbalance the evil. When it is necessary to punish a child, it should be done in such a calm and reasonable manner as to convince him that you do it for his good, and not because you are in a rage. Slaves, all the world over, are generally much addicted to lying. The reason is, that if they have done any mischief by carelessness or accident, they dare not tell the truth about it for fear of a cruel flogging. Violent and tyrannical treatment always produces that effect. Wherever children are abused, whether they are white or black, they become very cunning and deceitful; for when the weak are tortured by the strong, they have no other way to save themselves from suffering. Such treatment does not cure faults. It only makes people lie to conceal their faults. If a child does anything wrong and confesses it frankly, his punishment ought to be slight, in order to encourage him in habits of truthfulness, which is one of the noblest attributes of manhood. If he commits the same fault a second time, even if he confesses it, he ought not to be let off so easily, because it is necessary to teach him that confession, though a very good thing, will not supply the place of repentance. When children are naughty, it is better to deprive them of some pleasant thing that they want to eat or drink or do, than it is to kick and cuff them. It is better to attract them towards what is right than to drive them from what is wrong. Thus, if a boy is lazy, it is wiser to promise him reward in proportion to his industry than it is to cuff and scold him, which will only make him shirk work as soon as you are out of sight. Whereas, if you tell him, you shall have 6 cents if you dig 1 bushel of potatoes, and 6 cents more if you dig 2, he will have a motive that will stimulate him when you are not looking after him. If he is too lazy to be stimulated by such offers, he must be told that he who digs no potatoes must have none to eat. The moral education which you are all the time giving your children, by what they hear you say and see you do, is of more consequence to them than reading and writing and ciphering. But the education they get at school is also very important, and it will be wise and kind in you to buy such books as they need, and encourage them in every way to become good scholars as well as good men. By doing so you will not only benefit them, but you will help all your race. Every colored man or woman who is virtuous and intelligent takes away something of prejudice against colored men and women in general, and it likewise encourages all their brethren and sisters by showing what colored people are capable of doing. The system of slavery was all penalty and no attraction. In other words, it punished men if they did not do, but it did not reward them for doing. In the management of your children you should do exactly the opposite of this. You should appeal to their manhood, not to their fears. After emancipation in the West Indies, planters who had been violent slaveholders, if they saw a freedman leaning on his hoe, would say, "Work, you black rascal, or I'll flog you," and the freedman would lean all the longer on his hoe. Planters of a more wise and moderate character, if they saw the emancipated laborers idling away their time, would say, "We expect better things of free men," and that appeal to their manhood made the hoes fly fast. Old men and women have been treated with neglect and contempt in slavery, because they were no longer able to work for the profit of their masters. But respect and tenderness are particularly due to the aged. They have done much and suffered much. They are no longer able to help themselves, and we should help them, as they helped us in the feebleness of our infancy, and as we may again need to be helped in the feebleness of age. Any want of kindness or civility toward the old ought to be very seriously rebuked in children, and affectionate attentions should be spoken of as praiseworthy. Slavery in every way fosters violence. Slave children, being in the habit of seeing a great deal of beating, early form the habit of kicking and banging each other when they are angry, and of abusing poor helpless animals entrusted to their care. On all such occasions parents should say to them, "Those are the ways of slavery. We expect better things of free children." An honorable record. In 1837 the colored population in Philadelphia numbered 18,768. Many of them were poor and ignorant, and some of them were vicious, as would be the case with any people under such discouraging influences. But, notwithstanding they were excluded by prejudice from all the most profitable branches of industry, they had acquired property valued at $1,350,000. $550,000 was in real estate, and $800,000 was personal property. They had built 16 churches, valued at $114,000, for the support of which they annually paid over $6,000. The pauper tax they paid was more than enough to support all the colored paupers in the city. They had 80 benevolent societies, and during that year they had expended $14,172 for the relief of the sick and helpless. A number of them who had been slaves had paid in the course of that year $70,733 to purchase their own freedom, or that of their relatives. End of Education of Children. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 44 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Thank God for Little Children by Frances E.W. Harper. Thank God for little children, bright flowers by earth's wayside, the dancing joyous lifeboats upon life's stormy tide. Thank God for little children. When our skies are cold and gray, they come as sunshine to our hearts, and charm our cares away. I almost think the angels who tend life's garden fair drop down the sweet wild blossoms that bloom around us here. It seems a breath of heaven round many a cradle lies, and every little baby brings a message from the skies. The humblest home, with children, is rich in precious gems, better than wealth of monarchs, or golden diadems. Dear mothers, guard these jewels as sacred offerings meet, a wealth of household treasures to lay at Jesus' feet. End of Thank God for Little Children. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 45 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sam and Andy by Harriet Beecher Stowe. A beautiful slave in Kentucky, named Eliza, had a very handsome little boy. One day she overheard her master making a bargain with a slave trader by the name of Haley to sell them both. She made her escape that night, taking her child with her. Her mistress, who was much attached to her, and did not want to have her sold, was glad when she heard that Eliza was gone. But her master, who was afraid the trader would think he had helped her off after he had taken the money for her, ordered the horses Bill and Jerry to be brought, and 2 of his slaves, called Sam and Andy, to go with the slave trader in pursuit of the fugitive. The way they contrived how not to overtake Eliza is thus told in Uncle Tom's Cabin. "Sam, hello, Sam," said Andy. "Massa wants you to cotch Bill and Jerry." "Hi, what's afoot now?" said Sam. "Why, I suppose you don't know that Lizzie's cut stick, and cleared out, with her young'n." "You teach your granny," replied Sam, with infinite contempt. "Knowed it a heap sooner than you did. This nigger ain't so green now." "Wall, anyhow, Massa wants Bill and Jerry geared right up, and you and I's to go with Mas'r Haley to look arter her," said Andy. Sam, who had just been contriving how he could make himself of importance on the plantation, exclaimed, "Good now! Dat's de time of day. It's Sam's dat's called for in dese here times. He's de nigger. Mass'll see what Sam can do." "Ah, you better think twice," said Andy, "for Missis don't want her cotched, and she'll be in your wool." "Hi! How'd you know dat?" said Sam, opening his eyes. "Heard her say so my own self, dis blessed mornin', when I bring in Mas'r's shavin' water. She sent me to see why Lizzie didn't come to dress her, and when I telled her she was off, she just rise up, and says she, 'The Lord be praised.' Mas'r he seemed rail mad, and says he, 'Wife, you talk like a fool.' But Lord, she bring him to. I knows well enough how that'll be. It allers best to stand Missis' side the fence, now I tell you," said Andy. Sam scratched his woolly pate, and gave a hitch to his pantaloons, as he had a habit of doing when his mind was perplexed. "Dere ain't never no sayin' about no kind of thing in dis yere world," said he at last. "Now I'd a said sartin that Missis would a scared the varsal world after Lizzie." "So she would," said Andy. "But can't ye see through a ladder, ye black nigger? Missis don't want dis yere Mas'r Haley to get Lizzie's boy. Dat's to go. And I specs you better be making tracks for dem hosses, mighty sudden too, for I hearn Missis queerin' arter you. So you've stood foolin' long enough." Sam, upon this, began to bestir himself in earnest, and after a while appeared, bearing down gloriously towards the house, with Bill and Jerry in a full canter. Adroitly throwing himself off before they had any idea of stopping, he brought them up alongside the horse-post like a tornado. Haley's horse, which was a skittish young colt, winced and bounced, and pulled hard at his halter. "Ho, ho!" said Sam. "Scary, are ye?" And his black face lighted up with a curious, mischievous gleam. "I'll fix ye now," said he. There was a large beech tree overshadowing the place, and the small, sharp, triangular beech nuts lay scattered thickly on the ground. Sam stroked and patted the colt, and while pretending to adjust the saddle, he slipped under it a sharp little nut, in such a manner that the least weight brought upon the saddle would annoy the nervous animal, without leaving any perceptible wound. "Dar, me fix 'em," said he, rolling his eyes with an approving grin. At this moment Mrs. Shelby appeared on the balcony, and beckoned to him. "Why have you been loitering so, Sam?" said she. "I sent Andy to tell you to hurry." "Bress you, Missis, hosses won't be cotched all in a minute. They done cleared out down the south pasture, and everywhere," said Sam. "Well, Sam," replied his mistress, "you were to go with Mr. Haley to show him the road, and help him. Be careful of the horses, Sam. You know Jerry was a little lame last week. Don't ride them too fast." She spoke the last words in a low voice and with strong emphasis. "Let dis chile alone for dat," said Sam, rolling up his eyes with a look full of meaning. "Yes, Missis, I'll look out for de hosses." Sam returned to his stand under the beech tree, and said to Andy, "Now, Andy, I would be tall surprised if dat ar gentleman's critter should gib a fling, by and by, when he comes to be a getting up. You know, Andy, critters will do such things." And Sam poked Andy in the side, in a highly suggestive manner. "Hi!" exclaimed Andy, with an air that showed he understood instantly. "Yes, you see, Andy, Missis wants to make time," said Sam. "Dat ar's clear to the most ordinary observer. I just make a little for her. Now, you see, get all dese yere hosses loose, caperin' permiscus round dis here lot,
and down to the wood there, and I 'spect Mas'r won't be off in a hurry." Andy grinned. "You see, Andy," said Sam, "if any such thing should happen as that Mas'r Haley's hoss should begin to act contrary and cut up, you and I just lets go of our own to help him. Oh, yes, we'll help him." And Sam and Andy laid their heads back on their shoulders, and broke into a low, immoderate laugh, snapping their fingers and flourishing their heels with exquisite delight. While they were enjoying themselves in this style, Haley appeared on the veranda. Some cups of very good coffee had somewhat mollified him, and he came out smiling and talking in tolerably restored humor. Sam and Andy clawed for their torn hats, and flew to the horse-post to be ready to "help Mas'r." The brim of Sam's hat was all unbraided, and the slivers of the palm-leaf started apart in every direction, giving it a blazing air of freedom and defiance. The brim had gone entirely from Andy's hat, but he thumped the crown on his head, and looked about well pleased, as if to ask, "Who says I haven't got a hat?" "Well, boys," said Haley, "be alive now. We must lose no time." "Not a bit of him, Mas'r," said Sam, putting Haley's rein into his hand, and holding his stirrup, while Andy was untying the other two horses. The instant Haley touched the saddle, the mettlesome creature bounded from the earth with a sudden spring, that threw his master sprawling some feet off, on the dry, soft turf. With frantic ejaculations, Sam made a dive at the reins, but only succeeded in brushing the torn slivers of his hat into the horse's eyes, which by no means tended to allay the confusion of his nerves. With 2 or 3 contemptuous snorts, he upset Sam, flourished his heels vigorously in the air, and pranced away toward the lower end of the lawn. He was followed by Bill and Jerry, whom Andy had not failed to let loose, according to contract, speeding them off with various direful cries. And now there was a sense of great confusion. Sam and Andy ran and shouted. Dogs ran barking here and there. Mike, Mose, Mandy, Fanny, and all the smaller specimens on the place, raced, whooped, shouted, and clapped their hands with outrageous zeal. Haley's fleet horse entered into the spirit of the scene with great gusto. He raced round the lawn, which was 1/2 a mile in extent, and seemed to take a mischievous delight in letting his pursuers come within a hand's breadth of him, and then whisking off again with a start and a snort. Sam's torn hat was seen everywhere. If there seemed to be the least chance that a horse could be caught, down he bore upon him full tilt, shouting, "Now for it! Cotch him! Cotch him!" in a way that set them all to racing again. Haley ran up and down, stamped, cursed, and swore. The master in vain tried to give some directions from the balcony, and the mistress looked from her chamber window and laughed. She had some suspicion that Sam was the cause of all this confusion. At last, about 12 o'clock, Sam appeared, mounted on Jerry, leading Haley's horse, reeking with sweat, but with flashing eyes and dilated nostrils, showing that the spirit of freedom had not yet entirely subsided. "He's cotched!" exclaimed Sam, triumphantly. "If it hadn't been for me they might have bust themselves, all on 'em. But I cotched him." "You!" growled Haley. "If it hadn't been for you, this never would have happened." "Bress us, Mas'r!" exclaimed Sam, "when it's me that's been a racin' and chasin' till the sweat just pours off me." "Well, well," said Haley, "you've lost me near 3 hours with your cursed nonsense. Now let's be off, and have no more fooling." "Why, Mas'r," said Sam in a deprecating tone, "I do believe you mean to kill us all clar, hosses and all. Here we are all just ready to drop down, and the critters all in a reek of sweat. Sure Massa won't think of starting now till arter dinner. Massa's horse wants rubbing down. See how he's splashed hisself? And Jerry limps too. Don't think Missus would be willing to have us start this yere way, no how. Bress you, Massa, we can catch up if we stop. Libby never was no great of a walker." The mistress, who, greatly to her amusement, overheard this conversation from the veranda, now came forward and courteously urged Mr. Haley to stay to dinner, saying that the cook should bring it on the table immediately. All things considered, the slave trader concluded it was best to do so. As he moved toward the parlor, Sam rolled his eyes after him with unutterable meaning, and gravely led the horses to the stable. When he had fairly got beyond the shelter of the barn and fastened the horse to a post, he exclaimed, "Did you see 'em, Andy? Did you see 'em? Oh, Lord, if it warn't as good as a meetin' now, to see him a-dancin' and a-kickin' and a-swearin' at us! Didn't I hear him? 'Swear away, old fellow,' says I to myself. 'Will you have your horse now, or wait till you cotch him?' says I. And Sam and Andy leaned up against the barn, and laughed to their hearts' content. Yer oughter seen how mad he looked when I brought the hoss up. Lor, he'd a killed me if he durst to. And there I was, a-standin' as innocent and humble." "Lor, I seed you," said Andy. "Ain't you an old hoss, Sam?" "Rather 'spects I am," said Sam. "Did you see Missis upstairs at the winder? I seed her laughin'." "I'm sure I was a-racin', so I didn't see nothin'," said Andy. "Well, yer see, I's quiet a habit of observation," said Sam. "It's a very 'portant habit, Andy, and I commend you to be cultivatin' it, now you're young. Bobservation makes all de difference in niggers. Didn't I see what Missis wanted, though she never let on? Dat ar's bobservation, Andy. I 'spects it's what you may call a faculty. Faculties is different in different peoples, but cultivation of 'em goes a great way. I guess if I hadn't helped your bobservation this mornin', you wouldn't have seen your way so smart," said Andy. "You's a promisin' child, Andy. There ain't no manner o' doubt," said Sam. "I think lots of you, Andy, and I don't feel no ways ashamed to take ideas from you. Let's go up to the house now, Andy. I'll be bound Missis'll give us an uncommon good bite dis year time." The mistress had promised that dinner should be brought on the table in a hurry, and she had given the orders in Haley's hearing. But the servants all seemed to have an impression that Missis would not be disobliged by delay. Aunt Chloe, the cook, went on with her operations in a very leisurely manner. Then it was wonderful what a number of accidents happened. One upset the butter. Another tumbled down with the water and had to go to the spring for more. Another spilled the gravy. Then Aunt Chloe set about making new gravy, watching it and stirring it with the greatest precision. If reminded that the orders were to hurry, she answered shortly that she "warn't a-goin' to have raw gravy on the table, to help nobody's catchin's." From time to time there was giggling in the kitchen, when news was brought that Mas'r Haley was mighty uneasy, and that he couldn't set in his chair no ways, but was a-walkin' and stalkin' to the winders and through the porch. "Sarves him right," said Aunt Chloe. "He'll get wuss nor uneasy, one o' these days, if he don't mend his ways." At last the dinner was sent in, and the mistress smiled and chatted, and did all she could to make the time pass imperceptibly. At 2 o'clock, Sam and Andy brought the horses up to the posts, apparently greatly refreshed and invigorated by the scamper of the morning. As Haley prepared to mount, he said, "Your master don't keep no dogs, I suppose?" "Heaps on 'em," said Sam triumphantly. "Thar's Bruno, he's a roarer; and besides that, about every nigger of us keeps a pup of some natur' or other." "But does your master keep any dogs for tracking out niggers?" said Haley. Sam knew very well what he meant, but he kept on a look of desperate simplicity. "Wall," said he, "our dogs all smells round considerable sharp. I suspect they's the kind, though they hadn't never had no practice. There's 4 dogs at most anything, though, if you get 'em started." He whistled to Bruno, a great lumbering Newfoundland dog, who came pitching tumultuously toward them. "You go hang!" exclaimed Haley, mounting his horse. "Come, tumble up now." Sam tumbled up accordingly, contriving to tickle Andy as he did so. This made Andy split out in a laugh, greatly to Haley's indignation, who made a cut at him with his riding-whip. "Astonished at you, Andy," said Sam, with awful gravity. "This yere's a serious business, Andy. You mustn't be a-making game. This yere ain't no way to help Massa." When they came to the boundaries of the estate, Haley said, "I shall take the road to the river. I know the way of all of 'em. They always make tracks for the underground." "Sartin, that's the idea," said Sam. "Massa Haley hits de thing right in the middle. Now dere's 2 roads to de river, de dirt road and de pike. Which Massa mean to take?" Andy looked up innocently at Sam, surprised at hearing this new geographical fact, but he instantly confirmed what Sam said. "I'd rather be 'clined to imagine that Lizy'd take de dirt road, being it the least travelled," said Sam. Though Haley was an old bird, and inclined to be suspicious of chaff, he was rather brought up by this view of the case. He pondered a moment, and said, "If yer wasn't both on yers such cussed liars, now." The pensive tone in which this was spoken amused Andy prodigiously. He fell a little behind, and shook so with laughter as to run a great risk of falling from his horse. But Sam's face was immovably composed into the most doleful gravity. "Course, Massa can do as he'd ruther," said Sam. "It's all one to us. When I study upon it, I think de straight road is de best." "She would naturally go a lonesome way," said Haley. "I should imagine so," said Sam. "But gals is peculiar. They never does nothin' you thinks they will, most generally de contrar. So if you thinks you've gone one road, it's sartin you better go de udder, and then you'll be sure to find 'em. So I think we'd better take the straight road." Haley announced decidedly that he should go the other, and asked when they should come to it. "A little piece ahead," said Sam, giving a wink to Andy. He added gravely, "I studied on the matter, and I'm quite clear we ought not to go dat ar way. I neber been over it no way. It's desp't lonesome, and we might lose our way. And now I think on it, I hearn him tell dat ar road was all fenced up down by the creek. Ain't it, Andy?" Andy wasn't certain. He'd only hearn tell about that road, but he had never been over it. Haley thought the first mention of the road was involuntary on Sam's part, and that upon second thoughts he had lied desperately to dissuade him from taking that direction because he was unwilling to implicate Eliza. Therefore he struck briskly into the road, and was followed by Sam and Andy. The road, in fact, had formerly been an old thoroughfare to the river, but after the laying of the new pike it had been abandoned. It was open for about an hour's ride, and after that it was cut across by various farms and fences. Sam knew this perfectly well. Indeed, the road had been so long closed that Andy had never heard of it. He therefore rode along with an air of dutiful submission, only groaning occasionally, and saying it was "desp't rough, and bad for Jerry's foot." "Now I just give yer warnin'. I know yer," said Haley. "You won't get me to turn off this yere road with all yer fussin', so you shet up." "Massa will go his own way," said Sam, with rueful submission, at the same time winking portentously to Andy. whose delight was now very near the explosive point. Sam was in wonderful spirits. He professed to keep a very brisk lookout. At one time he exclaimed that he saw "a gal's bunnet" at the top of some distant eminence. At another time he called out to Andy to ask if "that there wasn't 'Liza down in the holler." He was always sure to make these exclamations in some rough or craggy part of the road, where the sudden quickening of speed was a special inconvenience to all parties concerned, thus keeping Haley in a state of constant commotion. After riding about an hour in this way, the whole party made a precipitate and tumultuous descent into a barnyard belonging to a large farming establishment. Not a soul was in sight, all the hands being employed in the fields. But as the barn stood square across the road, it was evident that their journey in that direction had reached its end. "You rascal!" said Haley. "You knew all about this." "Didn't I tell ye I knowed, and you wouldn't believe me?" replied Sam. "I telled Master it was all shut up, and fenced up, and I didn't 'spect we could get through. Andy heard me." This was too true to be disputed, and the unlucky man had to pocket his wrath as well as he could. All three faced to the right about, and took up their line of march for the highway. The consequence of all these delays was, that they reached the Ohio River only in season to see Eliza and her child get safely on the other side, by jumping from one mass of floating ice to the other. "The gal's got 7 devils in her, I believe," said Haley. "How like a wild cat she jumped!" "Well, now," said Sam, scratching his head, "I hope Mas'r 'scuse us tryin' dat ar road. Don't think I feel spry enough for dat ar, no way." And Sam gave a hoarse chuckle. "You laugh!" exclaimed the slave trader with a growl. "I couldn't help it now, Mas'r," said Sam, giving way to the long pent-up delight of his soul. "She looks so curious, a leapin' and springin', ice a crackin', and only to hear her, plump, ka-chunk, ka-plash." And Sam and Andy laughed till the tears rolled down their cheeks. "I'll make yer laugh till the other side of yer mouths," exclaimed the trader, laying about their heads with his riding-whip. Both ducked and ran shouting up the bank. They were on their horses before he could come up with them. With much gravity Sam called out, "Good evening, Mas'r Haley. Won't want us no longer. I 'spect Missis be anxious 'bout Jerry. Missis wouldn't hear of our riding the critters over Lizy's bridge to night." With a poke into Andy's ribs, they started off at full speed, their shouts of laughter coming faintly on the wind. Sam was in the highest possible feather. He expressed his exultation by all sorts of howls and ejaculations, and by divers odd motions and contortions of his whole system. Sometimes he would sit backward with his face to the horse's tail. Then, with a whoop and a somerset, he would come right up in his place again, and, drawing on a grave face, he would begin to lecture Andy for laughing and playing the fool. Anon, slapping his sides with his arms, he would burst forth in peals of laughter, that made the old woods ring as they passed. With all these evolutions, he contrived to keep the horses up to the top of their speed, until between 10 and 11 their heels resounded on the gravel at the end of the balcony. His mistress flew to the railings and called out, "Is that you, Sam? Where are they?" "Mas'r Haley is a resting at the tavern," said Sam. "He's dreadful fatigued, Missis." "And Eliza, where is she, Sam?" "Well, Missis, the Lord he preserves his own. Lizy's done gone over the river into 'Hio, as markably as if the Lord took her over in a chariot of fire and 2 horses." His master, who had followed his wife to the veranda, said, "Come up here, and tell your mistress what she wants to know." Sam soon appeared at the parlor door, hat in hand. In answer to their questions, he told his story in lively style. "Dis yere's a Providence, and no mistake," said Sam, piously rolling up his eyes. "As Missis has always been instructin' on us, that allers instruments rise up to do de Lord's will. Now if it hadn't been for me to day, Lizy'd been took a dozen times. Wouldn't it I started off de horses, dis yere mornin', and kept 'em chasin' till dinner time? And didn't I call Mas'r Harley 5 miles out of de road dis evenin'? Else he'd a come up with Lizy, as easy as a dog arter a coon. Dese yere's all providences." With as much sternness as he could command under the circumstances, his master said, "They are the kind of providences that you'll have to be pretty sparing of, Sam. I allow no such practices with gentlemen on my place." Sam stood with the corners of his mouth lowered, in most penitential style. "Mas'r's quite right," said he. "It was ugly on me. There's no disputin' that ar; and of course Mas'r and Missis wouldn't encourage no such works. I'm sensible ob dat ar. But a poor nigger like me's 'mazin' tempted to act ugly sometimes, when fellers will cut up such shines as dat ar Mas'r Haley. He ain't no gentleman, no way. Anybody's been raised as I've been can't help a seein' dat ar." "Well, Sam," said his mistress, "as you seem to have a proper sense of your errors, you may go now and tell Aunt Chloe she may get you some of that cold ham that was left of dinner to day. You and Andy must be hungry." "Missis is a heap too good for us," said Sam, making his bow with alacrity and departing. Having done up his piety and humility to the satisfaction of the parlor, as he trusted, he clapped his palm leaf on his head with a sort of free and easy air, and proceeded to the dominions of Aunt Chloe, with the intention of flourishing largely in the kitchen. End of Sam and Andy. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 46 of the Freedmen's book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. John Brown and the Colored Child by L. Maria Child. When John Brown went from the jail to the gallows in Charleston, Virginia, December 2, 1859, he stooped to kiss a little colored child. A winter sunshine still and bright, the blue hills bathed with golden light, and earth was smiling to the sky, when calmly he went forth to die. Infernal passions festered there, where peaceful nature looked so fair, and fiercely in the morning sun flashed glittering bayonet and gun. The old man met no friendly eye when last he looked on earth and sky, but one small child with timid air was gazing on his hoary hair. As that dark brow to his upturned, the tender heart within him yearned, and fondly stooping o'er her face, he kissed her for her injured race. The little one, she knew not why that kind old man went forth to die, nor why, mid all that pomp and stir, he stooped to give a kiss to her. But Jesus smiled that sight to see, and said, He did it unto me. The golden harps then sweetly rung, and this the song the angels sung: Who loves the poor doth love the Lord. Earth cannot dim thy bright reward. We hover o'er yon gallows high, and wait to bear thee to the sky. John Brown, on his way to the scaffold, stooped to take up a slave child. That closing example was the legacy of the dying man to his country. That benediction we must continue and fulfill. In this new order, equality, long postponed, shall become the master principle of our system, and the very frontispiece of our Constitution. Hon. Charles Sumner. Christ told me to remember those in bonds as bound with them, to do toward them as I should wish them to do toward me in similar circumstances. My conscience bade me to do that. Therefore I have no regret for the transaction for which I am condemned. I think I feel as happy as Paul did when he lay in prison. He knew if they killed him it would greatly advance the cause of Christ. That was the reason he rejoiced. On that same ground I do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. John Brown. End of John Brown. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 47 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Heir of Freedom by Francis E. W. Harper. Written at Niagara Falls in 1856. I have just returned from Canada. I have gazed for the first time upon free land. Would you believe it? The tears sprang to my eyes, and I wept. It was a glorious sight to gaze, for the first time, on the land where a poor slave, flying from our land of boasted liberty, would in a moment find his fetters broken and his shackles loosed. Whatever he was in the land of Washington, in the shadow of Bunker Hill Monument, or even upon Plymouth Rock, here he becomes a man and a brother. I had gazed on Harper's Ferry, or rather the rock at the ferry, towering up in simple grandeur, with the gentle Potomac gliding peacefully at its feet, and I felt that it was God's masonry. My soul expanded while gazing on its sublimity. I had heard the ocean singing its wild chorus of sounding waves, and the living chords of my heart thrilled with ecstasy. I have since seen the rainbow-crowned Niagara, girdled with grandeur and robed with glory, chanting the choral hymn of omnipotence. But none of these sights have melted me, as did the first sight of free land. Towering mountains, lifting their hoary summits to catch the first faint flush of day, when the sunbeams kiss the shadows from morning's drowsy face, may expand and exalt your soul. The first view of the ocean may fill you with strange delight. The great, the glorious Niagara may hush your spirit with its ceaseless thunder. It may charm you with its robe of crested spray, and with its rainbow crown. But the land of freedom has a lesson of deeper significance than foaming waves and towering mountains. It carries the heart back to that heroic struggle in Great Britain for the emancipation of the slaves, in which the great heart of the people throbbed for liberty, and the mighty pulse of the nation beat for freedom, till 800,000 men, women, and children in the West Indies arose redeemed from bondage and freed from chains. End of The Heir of Freedom. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 48 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Emancipation in the District of Columbia, April 16, 1862, by James Madison Bell. Unfurl your banners to the breeze. Let freedom's tocsin sound amain.
until the islands of the seas re-echo with the glad refrain, "Columbia's free! Columbia's free!" Her teeming streets, her vine-clad groves, Are sacred now to Liberty, and God, who every right approves. Thank God, the Capitol is free! The slaver's pen, the auction block, the gory lash of cruelty, no more this nation's pride shall mock. No more within those 10 miles square shall men be bought and women sold, nor infants sable-hued and fair exchanged again for paltry gold. To-day the Capitol is free, and free those halls where Adam stood to plead for man's humanity and for a common brotherhood, where Sumner stood, with massive frame, whose eloquent philosophy has clustered round his deathless name bright laurels for eternity, where Wilson, Lovejoy, Wade, and Hale, and other lights of equal power have stood, like warriors clad in mail, before the giant of the hour, co-workers in a common cause, laboring for their country's weal by just enactments, righteous laws, and burning eloquent appeal. To them we owe and gladly bring the grateful tributes of our hearts, and while we live to muse and sing, these in our songs shall claim their parts. To-day Columbia's air doth seem much purer than in days agone, and now her mighty heart, I deem, hath lighter grown by marching on. End of Emancipation in the District of Columbia. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 49 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Laws of Health by L. Maria Child. There are 3 things peculiarly essential to health: plenty of fresh water, plenty of pure air, and enough of nourishing food. If possible, the human body should be washed all over every day; but if circumstances render that difficult, the operation should be performed at least 2 or 3 times a week. People in general are not aware how important frequent bathing is. The cuticle, or skin, with which the human body is covered, is like fine network, or lace. By help of a magnifying glass, called a microscope, it can be seen that there are 1,000 holes in every inch of our skin. In the skin of a middle-sized man there are 2,304,000 of these holes, called pores. Those pores are the mouths of exceedingly small vessels made to carry off fluids, which are continually formed in the human body, and need to be continually carried off. This process is going on all the time, whether we are sleeping or waking, hot or cold. When we are cool and at rest, that which passes off is invisible, and because we see no signs of it, and are not sensible of it, it is called insensible perspiration. But in very hot weather, or when we exercise violently, a saltish fluid passes through our pores in great drops, which we call sweat, and because we can see and feel it, it is called sensible perspiration. If the pores of the body are filled up with dust or any kind of dirt, the fluids cannot pass off through them, as nature intended, and being shut up, they become corrupt and produce fevers and bad humors. This is the reason why physicians always advise people to be careful and keep their pores open. In order to do this, dust and dirt should be frequently washed away. Many a fever and many a troublesome sore might be prevented by frequent bathing. Moreover, the skin looks smoother and handsomer when it is washed often. If a pond or river is near by, it is well to swim a few minutes every day or two. If not, the body should be washed with a pail of water and a rag. But it is not safe to go into cold water or to apply it to the skin when you are very much heated, nor is it safe to drink much cold water until you get somewhat cool. The best way is to plunge into water when you first get up in the morning, and then rub yourself with a cloth till you feel all of a glow. It takes but a few minutes, and you will feel more vigorous for it all day. Cool water is more healthy to wash in than warm water. It makes a person feel stronger, and it is not attended with any danger of catching cold afterward. But water directly from the well is too chilly. It is better to use it when it has been standing in the house some hours. Garments worn next to the skin, and the sheets in which you sleep, imbibe something of the fluids all the time passing from the body. Therefore they should be washed every week. I am aware that, as slaves, you had no beds or sheets, but as freemen I hope you will gradually be able to provide yourselves with such comforts. Meanwhile, sleep the cleanest way that you can, for that is one way to avoid sickness. When the skin is hot and feverish, it does a great deal of good to wipe the face, arms, and legs with a cloth moistened with cool water, changed occasionally. Headache is often cured by placing the feet in cool water a minute or two, and then rubbing them smartly with a dry cloth. Sitting in cool water 15 or 20 minutes is also recommended for headache or dizziness. A cut or bruise heals much quicker if it is soaked 10 or 15 minutes in cool water, then wrapped in 6 or 8 folds of wet rag, and covered with a piece of dry cloth. The rag should be moistened again when it gets dry. This simple process subdues the heat and fever of a wound. When the throat is sore, it is an excellent thing to wash the outside freely with cold water the first thing in the morning, and then wipe it very dry. A wet bandage at night, covered with a dry cloth, to keep it from the air, often proves very comforting when the throat is inflamed. Indeed, it is scarcely possible to say too much in favor of using cool water freely at suitable times. Fresh air is as important as good water. The lungs of the human body are all the time drawing in air and breathing out air. What we breathe out carries away with it something from our bodies. Therefore it is unhealthy to be in a room with many people, without doors or windows open. For the people draw in all the fresh air, and what they breathe out is more or less corrupted by having passed through their bodies. It is very important to health to have plenty of pure fresh air to breathe. No dirty things, or decaying substances, such as cabbage leaves or moldy vegetables, or pools of stagnant water, should be allowed to remain anywhere near a dwelling. The pools should be filled up, and the decaying things should be carried away from the house, heaped up and covered with earth to make manure for the garden. If there is not room enough to do that, they should be buried in the ground. Whole families often have fevers from breathing the bad odors that rise from such things. It is morally wrong to indulge in any habits that injure the health or well-being of others. The bed, and the coverings of the bed, should have fresh air let in upon them every day. Otherwise they retain the fluids which are passed from the body all the time. In England, children that worked in large manufactories became pale and sickly and died off fast. When doctors inquired into it, they found that the poor little creatures crept into the same bedclothes week after week and month after month without having them washed or aired. Occasional change in articles of food is healthy, as well as agreeable. But it is injurious to eat a great variety of things at the same meal. There are 2 good rules, so very simple that everybody, rich or poor, can observe them. First, never indulge yourself in eating what you have found by experience does not agree with you. Secondly, when you have eaten enough, do not continue to eat merely because the food tastes good. It is foolish to derange the stomach for a long time to please the palate for a short time.
If you have oppressed feelings in the head, or sour and bitter tastes in the mouth, or a tendency to sickishness, take nothing but bread and water for 2 or 3 days, and you will be very likely to save yourself from a fever. People might spare themselves many a toothache if they would rinse their mouths after every meal, and every night before going to bed remove every particle of food from between the teeth, and rinse them thoroughly with water. New toothpicks should be made often, for the sake of cleanliness. Dirt was a necessity of slavery, and that is one reason, among many others, why freemen should hate it, and try to put it away from their minds, their persons, and their habitations. End of The Laws of Health. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
Section 50 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. President Lincoln's Proclamation of Emancipation, January 1, 1863, by Francis E.W. Harper. It shall flash through the coming ages, it shall light the distant years, and eyes now dim with sorrow shall be brighter through their tears. It shall flush the mountain ranges, and the valleys shall grow bright. It shall bathe the hills in radiance, and crown their brows with light. It shall flood with golden splendor all the huts of Caroline, and the sun-kissed brow of labor with lustre new shall shine. It shall gild the gloomy prison darkened by the nation's crime, where the dumb and patient millions wait the better coming time. By the light that gilds their prison they shall see its mouldering key, and the bolts and bars shall vibrate with the triumphs of the free. Though the morning seem to linger o'er the hill-tops far away, now the shadows bear the promise of the quickly coming day. Soon the mists and murky shadows shall be fringed with crimson light, and the glorious dawn of freedom break refulgent on the sight. End of President Lincoln's Proclamation of Emancipation. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 51 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. New Year's Day on the Islands of South Carolina, 1863, by Charlotte L. Fortin. A few days before Christmas we were delighted at receiving a beautiful Christmas hymn from John G. Whittier, written especially for our children. They learned it very easily, and enjoyed singing it. We showed them the writer's picture, and told them he was a very good friend of theirs, who felt the deepest interest in them, and had written this hymn expressly for them to sing. This made them very proud and happy. Early Christmas morning we were wakened by the people knocking at the doors and windows, and shouting, "Merry Christmas!" After distributing some little presents among them, we went to the church, which had been decorated with holly, pine, cassina, mistletoe, and the hanging moss, and had a very Christmas-like look. The children of our school assembled there, and we gave them the nice comfortable clothing and the picture books which had been kindly sent by some Philadelphia ladies. There were at least 150 children present. It was very pleasant to see their happy, expectant little faces. To them it was a wonderful Christmas day, such as they had never dreamed of before. There was cheerful sunshine without, lighting up the beautiful moss drapery of the oaks, and looking in joyously through the open windows, and there were bright faces and glad hearts within. After the distribution of the gifts, the children were addressed by some of the gentlemen present. Then they sang the following hymn, which their good friend Whittier had written for them. "Oh, none in all the world before were ever so glad as we. We're free on Carolina's shore, we're all at home and free. Thou friend and helper of the poor, who suffered for our sake, to open every prison door and every yoke to break, bend low thy pitying face and mild, and help us sing and pray. The hand that blessed the little child upon our foreheads lay. We hear no more the driver's horn, no more the whip we fear. This holy day that saw thee born was never half so dear. The very oaks are greener clad, the waters brighter smile. Oh, never shone a day so glad on sweet St. Helen's Isle. We praise thee in our songs to-day, to thee in prayer we call. Make swift the feet and straight the way of freedom unto all. Come once again, O blessed Lord, come walking on the sea, and let the mainlands hear the word that sets the islands free. Then they sang John Brown's Hallelujah Song and several of their own hymns. Christmas night, the children came in and had several grand shouts. They were too happy to keep still. One of them, a cunning, kittenish little creature, named Amaretta, only 6 years old, has a remarkably sweet voice. "Oh, miss," said she, "all I want to do is to sing and shout." And sing and shout she did, to her heart's content. She reads nicely, and is very fond of books. Many of the children already know their letters. The parents are eager to have them learn. They sometimes say to me, "Do, miss, let the children learn eberyting they can. We neber have no chance to learn notin', but we wants de children to learn." They are willing to make many sacrifices that their children may attend school. One old woman, who had a large family of children and grandchildren, came regularly to school in the winter, and took her seat among the little ones. Another woman, who had one of the best faces I ever saw, came daily, and brought her baby in her arms. It happened to be one of the best babies in the world, and allowed its mother to pursue her studies without interruption. New Year's Day, Emancipation Day, was a glorious one to us. General Saxton and Colonel Higginson had invited us to visit the camp of the 1st Regiment of South Carolina Volunteers on that day, the greatest day in the nation's history. We enjoyed perfectly the exciting scene on board the steamboat Flora. There was an eager, wondering crowd of the freed people in their holiday attire, with the gayest of headkerchiefs, the whitest of aprons, and the happiest of faces. The band was playing, the flags were streaming, and everybody was talking merrily and feeling happy. The sun shone brightly, and the very waves seemed to partake of the universal gayety, for they danced and sparkled more joyously than ever before. Long before we reached Camp Saxton, we could see the beautiful grove and the ruins of the old fort near it. Some companies of the 1st Regiment were drawn up in line under the trees near the landing, ready to receive us. They were a fine, soldierly-looking set of men, and their brilliant dress made a splendid appearance among the trees. It was my good fortune to find an old friend among the officers. He took us over to camp and showed us all the arrangements. Everything looked clean and comfortable, much neater, we were told, than in most of the white camps. An officer told us that he had never seen a regiment in which the men were so honest. In many other camps, said he, the colonel and the rest of us would find it necessary to place a guard before our tents. We never do it here. Our tents are left entirely unguarded, but nothing has ever been touched. We were glad to know that, It is a remarkable fact, when we consider that the men of this regiment have all their lives been slaves, for we all know that slavery does not tend to make men honest. The ceremony in honor of emancipation took place in the beautiful grove of live oaks adjoining the camp. I wish it were possible to describe fitly the scene which met our eyes as we sat upon the stand and looked down on the crowd before us. There were the black soldiers in their blue coats and scarlet pantaloons, the officers of the First Regiment and of other regiments in their handsome uniforms, and there were crowds of lookers on, men, women, and children of every complexion, grouped in various attitudes under the moss-hung trees. The faces of all wore a happy, interested look. The exercises commenced with a prayer by the chaplain of the regiment. An ode, written for the occasion, was then read and sung. President Lincoln's proclamation of emancipation was then read, and enthusiastically cheered. The Reverend Mr. French presented Colonel Higginson with 2 very elegant flags, a gift to the First Regiment, from the Church of the Puritans in New York. He accompanied them by an appropriate enthusiastic speech. As Colonel Higginson took the flags, before he had time to reply to the speech, some of the colored people of their own accord began to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee we sing." It was a touching and beautiful incident, and sent a thrill through all our hearts. The Colonel was deeply moved by it. He said that reply was far more effective than any speech he could make. But he did make one of those stirring speeches which are half battles. All hearts swelled with emotion as we listened to his glorious words, stirring the soul like the sound of a trumpet. His soldiers are warmly attached to him, and he evidently feels toward them as if they were all his children. General Saxton spoke also, and was received with great enthusiasm. Throughout the morning repeated cheers were given for him by the regiment, and joined in heartily by all the people. They know him to be one of the best and noblest men in the world. His unfailing kindness and consideration for them, so different from the treatment they have sometimes received at the hands of United States officers, have caused them to have unbounded confidence in him. At the close of Colonel Higginson's speech, he presented the flags to the color bearers, Sergeant Rivers and Sergeant Sutton, with an earnest charge, to which they made appropriate replies. Mrs. Gage uttered some earnest words, and then the regiment sang John Brown's Hallelujah song. After the meeting was over, we saw the dress parade, which was a brilliant and beautiful sight. An officer told us that the men went through the drill remarkably well, and learned the movements with wonderful ease and rapidity. To us it seemed strange as a miracle to see this regiment of blacks, the first mustered into the service of the United States, thus doing itself honor in the sight of officers of other regiments, many of whom doubtless came to scoff. The men afterward had a great feast, 10 oxen having been roasted whole for their especial benefit. In the evening there was the softest, loveliest moonlight. We were very unwilling to go home, for besides the attractive society, we knew that the soldiers were to have grand shouts and a general jubilee that night. But the steamboat was coming, and we were obliged to bid a reluctant farewell to Camp Saxton and the hospitable dwellers therein. We walked the deck of the steamer singing patriotic songs, and we agreed that moonlight and water had never looked so beautiful as they did that night. At Beaufort we took the rowboat for St. Helena. The boatmen, as they rowed, sang some of their sweetest, wildest hymns. It was a fitting close to such a day. Our hearts were filled with an exceeding great gladness, for although the government had left much undone, We knew that freedom was surely born in our land that day. It seemed too glorious a good to realize, this beginning of the great work we had so longed for and prayed for. It was a sight never to be forgotten, that crowd of happy black faces from which the shadow of slavery had forever passed. Forever free, forever free. Those magical words in the President's proclamation were constantly singing themselves in my soul. End of New Year's Day on the Islands of South Carolina. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 52 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Song of the Negro Boatmen at Port Royal, South Carolina, by John G. Whittier. Oh, praise and tanks! De Lord he come to set de people free, and Massa think it day of doom, and we of jubilee. De Lord that heap de Red Sea waves, he just as strong as den. He say de word, we last night slaves, today de Lord's free men. De yam will grow, de cotton blow, we'll hab de rice and corn. Oh, nebber you fear if nebber you hear de driver blow his horn. Ole Massa, on he travels gone, he leaf de land behind. De Lord's breath blow him furder on, like corn shuck in de wind. We own de hoe, we own de plow, we own de hands that hold. We sell de pig, we sell de cow, but nebber child be sold. We pray de Lord, he give us signs dat some day we be free. De north wind tell it to de pines, de wild duck to de sea. We think it when de church bell ring, we dream it in de dream. De rice bird mean it when he sing, de eagle when he scream. We know de promise nebber fail, and nebber lie de word. So like de 'postles in de jail we waited for de Lord. And now he open ebery door, and trow away de key. He think we love him so before, we love him better free. De yam will grow, de cotton blow, he'll gib de rice and corn. Oh, nebber you fear if nebber you hear de driver blow his horn. End of The Song of the Negro Boatmen at Port Royal, South Carolina. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 53 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Extract from speech by Hon. Henry Wilson to the colored people in Charleston, South Carolina, April, 1865. For 29 years, in private life and in public life, at all times and on all occasions, I have spoken and voted against slavery, and in favor of the freedom of every man that breathes God's air or walks his earth. And to-day, standing here in South Carolina, I feel that the slave power we have fought so long is under my heel, and that the men and women held in bondage so long are free forevermore. Understanding this to be your position, that you are forever free, remember, oh, remember, the sacrifices that have been made for your freedom, and be worthy of the blessing that has come to you. I know you will be. Through these 4 years of bloody war, you have always been loyal to the old flag of the country. You have never betrayed the Union soldiers who were fighting the battles of the country. You have guided them. You have protected them. You have cheered them. You have proved yourselves worthy the great situation in which you were placed by the slaveholders' rebellion. 4 years ago you saw the flag of your country struck down from Fort Sumter. Yesterday you saw the old flag go up again. Its stars now beam with a brighter luster. You know now what the old flag means, that it means liberty to every man and woman in the country. You have been patient. You have endured. You have trusted in God and your country. And the God of our fathers has blessed our country, and he has blessed you. The long, dreary, chilly night of slavery has passed away forevermore, and the sun of liberty casts its broad beams upon you to-day. But your duties commence with your liberties. Remember that you are to be obedient, faithful, true, and loyal to the country forevermore. Remember that you are to educate your children, that you are to improve their condition, that you are to make a brighter future for them than the past has been to you. Remember that you are to be industrious. Freedom does not mean that you are not to work. It means that when you do work, you shall have pay for it, to carry home to your wives and the children of your love. Liberty means the liberty to work for yourselves, to have the fruits of your labor, to better your own condition and improve the condition of your children. I want every man and woman to understand that every neglect of duty, every failure to be industrious, to be economical, to support yourselves, to take care of your families, to secure the education of your children, will be put in the faces of your friends as a reproach. Your old masters will point you out and say to us, "We told you so." For more than 30 years we have said that you were fit for liberty. We have maintained it amid obloquy and reproach. For maintaining this doctrine in the halls of Congress, our names have been made a byword. The great lesson for you in the future is to prove that we were right, to prove that you were worthy of liberty. We simply ask you, in the name of your friends, in the name of our country, to show by your good conduct and by efforts to improve your condition that you were worthy of freedom, to prove to all the world, even to your old masters and mistresses, that it was a sin against God to hold you in slavery, and that you are worthy to have your names enrolled among the free men of the United States of America. We want you to respect yourselves, to walk erect with the consciousness that you are free men. Be humane and kind to each other, always serving each other when you can. Be courteous and gentlemanly to everybody on earth, black and white, but cringe to nobody. You have helped us to fight our battles. You have stood by the old flag. You have given us your prayers, and you have had the desire of your hearts fulfilled. The cause of freedom has triumphed, and in our triumph we want all to stand up and rejoice together. End of extract from speech by Hon. Henry Wilson to the colored people in Charleston, South Carolina, April, 1865. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 54 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Extract from a speech by Hon. Judge Kelly to the colored people in Charleston, South Carolina, April, 1865. I will not, my colored friends, talk to you of the past. You understand that all too well. I turn to the hopeful future,
not to flatter you for the deeds you have done during the last 4 years, but to remind you that, though you no longer have earthly masters, there is a ruler in heaven whom you are bound to obey. That great being who strengthened and guided your eminent friend, William Lloyd Garrison, who trained Abraham Lincoln for his great work, in honest poverty and simple-mindedness, that good God, whose stars shine the same over the slaves' huts and the masters' palaces. His laws you must obey. You must worship him not only at the altar, but in every act of your daily life. It will not be enough to observe the Sabbath, to go to him with your sorrows, and remember him in your joys. You must remember that he has said to man, "In the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat thy bread." Labor is the law of all. Your friends in the North appeal to you to help them in the great work they undertook to do for you. We want you to work with us. We want you to do it by working here in South Carolina, earning wages, taking care of your money, and making profit out of that money. Work on the plantation, if that is all you can do. If you can work in the workshop, do it, and work well. He who does a day's work not so well as he might have done it, cheats himself. Strive that your work on Monday shall be better done than it was on Saturday, and when Saturday comes round again, you will be able to do a still more skillful day's work. We at the North sometimes learn 3 or 4 trades. If any one of you feels sure that he can do better for himself and his family by changing his pursuit, he had better change it. I like to look at the women assembled here. Remember, my friends, that you are to be mothers and wives in the homes of free men. You must try to make those homes respectable and happy. You are to be the mothers of American citizens. You must give them the best education you can. You must strive to make them intelligent, educated, moral, patriotic, and religious men. Many of you cannot read, but you are not too old yet to learn. A mother who knows how to read can half educate her own child by helping him with his lessons, and the mother who has but little learning will get a great deal more by trying to hear the child's lessons. And so it is with the father. You need no longer live in slave huts, now that you are to have your own earnings. I charge you, men, to make your homes comfortable, and you, women, to make them happy. Work industriously. Be faithful to each other. Be true and honest with all men. If you respect yourselves, others will respect you. There are Northerners who are prejudiced against you, but you can find the way to their hearts and consciences through their pockets. When they find that there are colored tradesmen who have money to spend, and colored farmers who want to buy goods of them, they will no longer call you Jack and Joe. They will begin to think that you are Mr. John Black and Mr. Joseph Brown. End of extract from a speech by Honorable Judge Kelly to the colored people in Charleston, South Carolina, April, 1865.
Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 55 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Black Tom, by a Yankee Soldier. Hunted by his rebel master over many a hill and glade, Black Tom, with his wife and children, found his way to our brigade. Tom had sense and truth and courage, often tried where danger rose. Once our flag his strong arm rescued from the grasp of rebel foes. One day, Tom was marching with us through the forest as our guide, when a ball from traitor's rifle broke his arm and pierced his side. On a litter white men bore him through the forest drear and damp, laid him, dying, where our banners brightly fluttered o'er our camp. Pointing to his wife and children, while he suffered racking pain, said he to our soldiers round him, "Don't let them be slaves again." "No, by heaven," spoke out a soldier, and that oath was not profane, "our brigade will still protect them. They shall ne'er be slaves again." Over old Tom's dusky features came and stayed a joyous ray, and with saddened friends around him, his free spirit passed away. At Rodman's Point, in North Carolina, the United States troops were obliged to retreat before rebels, who outnumbered them 10 to 1. The scow in which they attempted to escape stuck in the mud, and could not be moved with poles. While the soldiers were lying down, they were in some measure protected from rebel bullets, but whoever jumped into the water to push the boat off would certainly be killed. A vigorous black man who was with them said, "Lie still. I will push off the boat. If they kill me, it is nothing. But you are soldiers, and are needed to fight for the country." He leaped overboard, pushed off the boat, and sprang back, pierced by 7 bullets. He died 2 days after. I wish I knew his name, for it deserves to be recorded with the noblest heroes the world has known. End of Black Tom. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 56 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter from a Freedman to his old master, written just as he dictated it. Dayton, Ohio, August 7th, 1865. To my old master, Colonel P.H. Anderson, Big Spring, Tennessee. Sir, I got your letter, and was glad to find that you had not forgotten Jordan, and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else can. I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this, for harboring Rebs they found at your house. I suppose they never heard about your going to Colonel Martin's to kill the Union soldier that was left by his company in their stable. Although you shot at me twice before I left you, I did not want to hear of your being hurt, and I am glad you are still living. It would do me good to go back to the dear old home again, and see Miss Mary and Miss Martha, and Allen, Esther, Green, and Lee. Give my love to them all, and tell them I hope we will meet in the better world, if not in this. I would have gone back to see you all when I was working in the Nashville hospital, but one of the neighbors told me that Henry intended to shoot me if he ever got a chance. I want to know particularly what the good chance is you propose to give me. I am doing tolerably well here. I get $25 a month, with victuals and clothing, have a comfortable home for Mandy. The folks call her Mrs. Anderson, and the children, Milly, Jane, and Grundy, go to school and are learning well. The teacher says Grundy has a head for a preacher. They go to Sunday school, and Mandy and me attend church regularly. We are kindly treated. Sometimes we overhear others saying, "Them colored people were slaves down in Tennessee." The children feel hurt when they hear such remarks, but I tell them it was no disgrace in Tennessee to belong to Colonel Anderson. Many darkies would have been proud, as I used to be, to call you master. Now, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage to move back again. As to my freedom, which you say I can have, there is nothing to be gained on that score, as I got my free papers in 1864 from the Provost Marshal General of the Department of Nashville. Mandy says she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you were disposed to treat us justly and kindly, and we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores, and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctors' visits to me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express, in care of V. Winters, Esquire, Dayton, Ohio. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we could have little faith in your promises in the future. We trust the good Maker has opened your eyes to the wrongs which you and your fathers have done to me and my fathers, in making us toil for you for generations without recompense. Here I draw my wages every Saturday night, but in Tennessee there was never any pay day for the negroes, any more than for the horses and cows. Surely there will be a day of reckoning for those who defraud the laborer of his hire. In answering this letter, please state if there would be any safety for my Milly and Jane, who are now grown up, and both good-looking girls. You know how it was with poor Matilda and Catherine. I would rather stay here and starve, and die if it come to that, than have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of their young masters. You will also please state if there has been any schools open for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life now is to give my children an education, and have them form virtuous habits. Say howdy to George Carter, and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting at me. From your old servant, Jordan Anderson. Sergeant W. H. Carney, of New Bedford, Massachusetts, was very severely wounded when the famous 54th Regiment attacked Fort Wagner, but he resolutely held up the Stars and Stripes as he dragged his wounded limb along amid a shower of bullets, and when he reached his comrades he exclaimed exultingly, "The dear old flag has never touched the ground, boys." End of Letter from a Freedman to his Old Master. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 57 of the Freedman's Book, by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Colonel Robert G. Shaw, by Eliza B. Sedgwick. In the summer of 1863 an attack was made on Fort Wagner, in South Carolina, by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, composed of colored troops. Their leader, Colonel Shaw, belonging to one of the best white families in Boston, was killed. When his friends asked for his body, the reply of the rebels was, "He is buried with his niggers." Buried with a band of brothers, whom for him would fain have died, buried with the gallant fellows who fell fighting by his side, buried with the men God gave him, those whom he was sent to save, buried with the martyred heroes, he has found an honored grave. Buried where his dust so precious makes the soil a hallowed spot, buried where by Christian patriot he shall never be forgot.
buried in the ground accursed, which man's fettered feet have trod, buried where his voice still speaketh, appealing for the slave to God. Fare thee well, thou noble warrior, who in youthful beauty went on a high and holy mission, by the God of battles sent. Chosen of him, elect and precious, well didst thou fulfill thy part. When thy country counts her jewels, she shall wear thee on her heart. End of Colonel Robert G. Shaw. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 58 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Advice from an Old Friend by L. Maria Child. For many years I have felt great sympathy for you, my brethren and sisters, and I have tried to do what I could to help you to freedom. And now that you have at last received the long-desired blessing, I most earnestly wish that you should make the best possible use of it. I have made this book to encourage you to exertion by examples of what colored people are capable of doing. Such men and women as Toussaint Louverture, Benjamin Banneker, Phillis Wheatley, Frederick Douglass, and William and Ellen Crafts prove that the power of character can overcome all external disadvantages, even that most crushing of all disadvantages, slavery. Perhaps few of you will be able to stir the hearts of large assemblies by such eloquent appeals as those of Frederick Douglass, or be able to describe what you have seen and heard so gracefully as Charlotte L. Fortin does. Probably none of you will be called to govern a state as Toussaint Louverture did, for such a remarkable career as his does not happen once in hundreds of years. But the Bible says, "He that ruleth his own spirit is greater than he that ruleth a kingdom," and such a ruler every man and woman can become, by the help and blessing of God. It is not the greatness of the thing a man does which makes him worthy of respect. It is the doing well whatsoever he hath to do. In many respects your opportunities for usefulness are more limited than those of others, but you have one great opportunity peculiar to yourselves. You can do a vast amount of good to people in various parts of the world, and through successive generations, by simply being sober, industrious, and honest. There are still many slaves in Brazil and in the Spanish possessions. If you are vicious, lazy, and careless, their masters will excuse themselves for continuing to hold them in bondage, by saying, "Look at the freedmen of the United States. What idle vagabonds they are! How dirty their cabins are! How slovenly their dress! That proves that negroes cannot take care of themselves, that they are not fit to be free." But if your houses look neat, and your clothes are clean and whole, and your gardens well weeded, and your work faithfully done, whether for yourselves or others, then all the world will cry out, "You see that negroes can take care of themselves, and it is a sin and a shame to keep such men in slavery." Thus, while you are serving your own interests, you will be helping on the emancipation of poor, weary slaves in other parts of the world. It is a great privilege to have a chance to do extensive good by such simple means, and your Heavenly Father will hold you responsible for the use you make of your influence. Your manners will have a great effect in producing an impression to your advantage or disadvantage. Be always respectful and polite toward your associates, and toward those who have been in the habit of considering you an inferior race. It is one of the best ways to prove that you are not inferior.
Never allow yourselves to say or do anything in the presence of women of your own color which it would be improper for you to say or do in the presence of the most refined white ladies. Such a course will be an education for them as well as for yourselves. When you appoint committees about your schools and other public affairs, it would be wise to have both men and women on the committees. The habit of thinking and talking about serious and important matters makes women more sensible and discreet. Such consultations together are in fact a practical school both for you and them, and the more modest and intelligent women are, the better will children be brought up. Personal appearance is another important thing. It is not necessary to be rich in order to dress in a becoming manner. A pretty dress for festival occasions will last a long while if well taken care of, and a few wild flowers or bright berries will ornament young girls more tastefully than jewels. Working clothes that are clean and nicely patched always look respectable, and they make a very favorable impression, because they indicate that the wearer is neat and economical. And here let me say that it is a very great saving to mend garments well, and before the rents get large. We thrifty Yankees have a saying that a stitch in time saves 9, and you will find by experience that neglected mending will require more than 9 stitches instead of 1, and will not look so well when it is done. The appearance of your villages will do much to produce a favorable opinion concerning your characters and capabilities. Whitewash is not expensive, and it takes but little time to transplant a Cherokee rose, a jessamine, or other wild shrubs and vines that make the poorest cabins look beautiful. And, once planted, they will be growing while you are working or sleeping. It is a public benefit to remove everything dirty or unsightly, and to surround homes with verdure and flowers, for a succession of pretty cottages makes the whole road pleasant, and cheers all passers-by, while they are at the same time an advertisement, easily read by all men, that the people who live there are not lazy, slovenly, or vulgar. The rich pay a great deal of money for pictures to ornament their walls, but a whitewashed cabin, with flowering shrubs and vines clustering round it, is a pretty picture, freely exhibited to all men. It is a public benefaction. But even if you are as yet too poor to have a house and garden of your own, it is still in your power to be a credit and an example to your race, by working for others as faithfully as you would work for yourself, by taking as good care of their tools as you would if they were your own, by always keeping your promises, however inconvenient it may be, by being strictly honest in all your dealings, by being temperate in your habits, and never speaking a profane or indecent word. By pursuing such a course, you will be consoled with an inward consciousness of doing right in the sight of God, and be a public benefactor by your example, while at the same time you will secure respect and prosperity for yourself by establishing a good character. A man whose conduct inspires confidence is in a fair way to have a house and land of his own, even if he starts in the world without a single cent. Be careful of your earnings, and as saving in your expenses as is consistent with health and comfort, but never allow yourselves to be stingy. Avarice is a mean vice, which eats all the heart out of a man. Money is a good thing, and you ought to want to earn it as a means of improving the condition of yourselves and families. But it will do good to your character and increase your happiness if you impart a portion of your earnings to others who are in need. Help as much as you conveniently can in building churches and schoolhouses for the good of all, and in providing for the sick and the aged. If your former masters and mistresses are in trouble, Show them every kindness in your power, whether they have treated you kindly or not. Remember the words of the blessed Jesus, "Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." There is one subject on which I wish to guard you against disappointment. Do not be discouraged if freedom brings you more cares and fewer advantages than you expected. Such a great change as it is from slavery to freedom cannot be completed all at once. By being brought up as slaves, you have formed some bad habits, which it will take time to correct. Those who were formerly your masters have acquired still worse habits by being brought up as slaveholders, and they cannot be expected to change all at once. Both of you will gradually improve under the teaching of new circumstances. For a good while it will provoke many of them to see those who were once their slaves acting like free men. They will doubtless do many things to vex and discourage you, just as the slaveholders in Jamaica did after emancipation there. They seem to want to drive the emancipated bondmen to insurrection, that they might have a pretext for saying, "You see what a bad effect freedom has on negroes. We told you it would be so." But the colored people of Jamaica behaved better than their former masters wished them to do. They left the plantations where they were badly treated or poorly paid, but they worked diligently elsewhere. Their women and children raised vegetables and fowls and carried them to market, and by their united industry and economy they soon had comfortable little homes of their own. I think it would generally be well for you to work for your former masters, if they treat you well, and pay you as much as you could earn elsewhere. But if they show a disposition to oppress you, quit their service, and work for somebody who will treat you like free men. If they use violent language to you, never use impudent language to them. If they cheat you, scorn to cheat them in return. If they break their promises, never break yours. If they propose to women such connections as used to be common under the bad system of slavery, teach them that freed women not only have the legal power to protect themselves from such degradation, but also that they have pride of character. If in fits of passion they abuse your children as they formerly did, never revenge it by any injury to them or their property. It is an immense advantage to any man always to keep the right on his side. If you pursue this course you will always be superior, however rich or elegant may be the man or woman who wrongs you. I do not mean by this that you ought to submit tamely to insult or oppression. Stand up for your rights, but do it in a manly way. Quit working for a man who speaks to you contemptuously, or who tries to take a mean advantage of you, when you are doing your duty faithfully by him. If it becomes necessary, apply to magistrates to protect you and redress your wrongs. If you are so unlucky as to live where the men in authority, whether civil or military, are still disposed to treat the colored people as slaves, let the most intelligent among you draw up a statement of your grievances and send it to some of your firm friends in Congress, such as the Honorable Charles Sumner, the Honorable Henry Wilson, and the Honorable George W. Julian. A good government seeks to make laws that will equally protect and restrain all men. Heretofore you had no reason to respect the laws of this country, because they punished you for crime, in many cases more severely than white men were punished, while they did nothing to protect your rights. But now that good President Lincoln has made you free, you will be legally protected in your rights, and restrained from doing wrong, just as other men are protected and restrained. It is one of the noblest privileges of free men to be able to respect the law, and to rely upon it always for redress of grievances, instead of revenging one wrong by another wrong. You will have much to put up with before the new order of things can become settled on a permanent foundation. I am grieved to read in the newspapers how wickedly you are still treated in some places. But I am not surprised, for I knew that slavery was a powerful snake that would try to do mischief with its tail after its head was crushed. But whatever wrongs you may endure, comfort yourself with two reflections. First, that there is the beginning of a better state of things, from which your children will derive much more benefit than you can. Secondly, that a great majority of the American people are sincerely determined that you shall be protected in your rights as free men. Year by year your condition will improve. Year by year, if you respect yourselves, you will be more and more respected by white men. Wonderful changes have taken place in your favor during the last 30 years, and the changes are still going on. The abolitionists did a great deal for you by their continual writing and preaching against slavery. Then this war enabled thousands of people to see for themselves what a bad institution slavery was, and the uniform kindness with which you treated the Yankee soldiers raised you up multitudes of friends. There are still many pro-slavery people in the Northern States, who, from aristocratic pride or low vulgarity, still call colored people niggers, and treat them as such. But the good leaven is now fairly worked into public sentiment, and these people, let them do what they will, cannot get it out. The providence of God has opened for you an upward path. Walk ye in it, without being discouraged by the brambles and stones at the outset. Those who come after you will clear them away, and will place in their stead strong, smooth rails for the steam car called Progress of the colored race. End of Advice from an Old Friend. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Section 59 of the Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Day of Jubilee by A.G. Duncan. Roll on, thou joyful day, when tyranny's proud sway, stern as the grave, shall to the ground be hurled, and freedom's flag unfurled shall wave throughout the world, o'er every slave. Trump of glad jubilee, echo o'er land and sea, freedom for all. Let the glad tidings fly, and every tribe reply, glory to God on high, at slavery's fall. End of Day of Jubilee. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. End of The Freedmen's Book by Lydia Maria Child.